All right. Hello again, fellow sapiens. Tonight, we step closer to the edge of a mirror. About 400,000 years ago, another kind of human walked the same windswept valleys we did. Broad-shouldered, firekeepers, toolmakers, storytellers perhaps, though their words are lost in the ice. This is Homo Neanderthalensis, the empathic hunter-architect. They built hearths in frozen caves, cared for their wounded, buried their dead, and maybe sang by firelight. For a long time they were not them, they were us, in another shape. You're listening to Sleepless Homo, soft science and slow storytelling for sleepless minds. Here, we don't dramatize evolution. We unfold it, quietly and in sequence. Every ochre-stained shell, every whisper in bone, every extinct heartbeat, a clue to how deep humanity really goes. Now imagine a winter sky so clear it rings like glass. The air bites, glittering with ice dust, and the horizon is long blue line where frozen plain meets dark forest. In that world of towering beasts and patient cold, a different kind of human steps into view. Their bodies are compact and powerful, wrapped in thick muscle and heat-hoarding proportions. Their faces carry new geometry for an old planet. Heavy brow ridges casting deep shade over watchful eyes, a broad nose designed to warm the breath before it meets the lungs, a skull housing a brain as large as ours but shaped by a different wind. We give them a name now because we need one, but they never used it. For hundreds of thousands of years they simply lived as themselves, and the land taught them who they were. What if the spark we call humanity didn't begin in a single place or a single mind, but spread through a family of species like embers carried on a north wind? In the long Middle Pleistocene, the climate settled into a new rhythm, where once the world swung between cool and warm on gentler cycles, the pendulum began to pause in deep winter, holding the cold longer and letting the ice build. Glaciers bit down into the mountains until they screamed. Rivers braided and unbraided across the lowlands with every freeze and thaw. Forests marched south and then crept north again, leaving pollen in the mud as a kind of diary. Europe, tucked at the edge of the great landmass, became a peninsula of experiments where cold trained bodies and minds to take nothing for granted. In this unsettled classroom, a lineage that shared ancestors with us bent toward a new shape, and by slow degrees a recognisably Neanderthal form emerged. To understand how, start with the air. Cold air is thin on moisture and harsh on lungs, and the path between nostril and chest became a place of innovation. The broad nasal aperture of these early Europeans, the forward pull of the midface, created a longer, roomier corridor for warming each breath. Inside the ribcage, a barrel-like chest increased capacity and stability, letting them draw strong, slow breaths while moving through snow or climbing slopes slick with rime. Farther down the limbs, nature applied old rules with new seriousness. In chill climates, heat is a treasure, and animals lose less of it when appendages are shorter. Over long winters and longer millennia, lower arms and legs tightened their proportions. Hands and feet stayed skilled but sturdy, a compromise between dexterity and the need to keep blood warm. Look at this body as a conversation with weather. Every line says, "I learned to keep a fire inside, now listen to the ground." The Pleistocene Earth writes in layers, and the story it tells for this time is a stacking of winters. Low dust blew off continental shelves exposed by low seas and settled in pale blankets across central plains. Permafrost cracked the soil. Thaw and refreeze sculpted patterned ground into nets and polygons. Underfoot, hoofprints recorded migrations like sentences. Herds of steppe bison and wild horse trellised through the grass when the climate opened the world, then slipped away as spruce and pine reclaimed their fields. In warm interludes that felt like gifts, straight-tusked elephants and even hippopotamuses wandered the far northwest, reminding anyone watching that Europe could be a green room between acts. But the main rhythm held, long spans of cold, short bursts of warmth, and endless rehearsals for survival. In this script, the Neanderthal body and mind rehearsed too, until both could perform without looking down. If you picture a face, you must also picture a skull, because the architecture of bone is the fossilized echo of living needs. The Neanderthal skull lengthened and rounded in a different way than ours, with the rear of the brain case shaped into a swelling that later prehistorians would nickname an occipital bun. The brow ridge became a stout bridge over the eyes, double-arched and firm, a feature that is easy to caricature and harder to explain. It may have been part structural, part developmental, a consequence of how the face and brain case grew together under new pressures. Behind the eyes, the vault enclosed a brain that rivaled and sometimes exceeded the size of ours, but size alone misleads. What matters is how that brain came to model a hard season, to track animals through white noise and crooked light, to memorize watercourses that change their minds each decade. In the mouth, the back of the jaw developed a small empty space behind the last molar, a retromolar gap that hints at the distinctive proportions of the Neanderthal face. In the teeth themselves, the roots of molars sometimes joined into expanded chambers, a taurodont pattern that opened internal space. It is all a set of little decisions written in enamel and bone, none of them chosen, all of them selected by what the land would allow. Across these centuries the sky did not sit still. On clear nights in the far north, curtains of green fire moved like breathing across frozen bays. Wind carved dunes out of snow and then erased them the next week. In spring, meltwater threaded old riverbeds with new silver, and on those banks alder and willow stitched the edges with a softer light. The animals that shared this world were both familiar and not. Woolly rhinoceroses grazed like armoured tractors where summer grass finally broke through. Cave bears claimed hollows and slept away long darkness. Lions without manes hunted where the forest thinned. Ravens watched it all and told no one. In this living atlas, Neanderthal ranges likely widened and narrowed with the seasons, following herds when the land opened and settling near reliable shelter, when the winds sharpened and game tightened its loops. When we talk about their origin, we're not only naming bones, we're marking a slow shift in the conversation between body and place. Many researchers point to an ancestor population that we sometimes call by another name, a generalized European and African lineage in the Middle Pleistocene that carried both the capacity for our shape and the capacity for theirs. Somewhere in the long window between roughly 600,000 and 400,000 years ago, European branches began to lean in the Neanderthal direction. In caves where deep shafts collected bones over centuries, skull fragments and jaws show early hints of that journey in progress. The brow starts to thicken. The face draws forward a little more. Teeth speak in quieter dialects of the same change. It is not a leap, but a steady migration through anatomy guided by climate, geography, and time. Regions mattered. Europe is not one thing in these ages. It is a mosaic repeatedly broken and reassembled. The Iberian Peninsula becomes a refuge when north winds strengthen, a place where forests can hide in river folds while the plateaus above them freeze. Italy and the Balkans arc like bridges between south and north, allowing groups to move when ice does not lock the passes. The great rivers, especially those that drain the heart of the continent, serve as highways for animals and the humans who trailed them. The Danube tells its quiet story through terraces packed with sediments that settled when water ran higher and colder, then cut down again as warmth returned. Each terrace is a shelf of time. The North European plain, when not buried under glacial scab, is an open book written in grass and scattered trees. If you were born there, your childhood would be a catalogue of horizons. If you were born in the mountains, your memories would be closer, more vertical, filled with firs and sudden drops and the low thunder of distant icefalls. This geographic quilt stitched populations apart and then pulled them close again, and across that rhythm the Neanderthal form kept clarifying. We often ask what kind of minds live behind those brows. It is a fair question, and also a cautious one. The skull can only tell us so much, and the land does not keep diaries of thought. Yet even before any later evidence of symbolism or ceremony appears in the record, the context of their emergence whispers a few careful truths. To persist in a climate with long winters and short grace requires memory that stretches from season to season. To navigate a terrain that changes its rules, each time the ice relaxes requires flexible maps in the head. To raise young under auroras means teaching them not just where to walk, but when and how to read the wind. None of this proves anything about language or art. It simply outlines a pressure that rewards foresight, patterns and bonds strong enough to weather slow disaster. If there is a spark we call humanity, it likely glowed in many hearths long before it leapt into the brighter blaze we recognise in ourselves. There is another truth in the bones that is easy to miss because it feels ordinary. The earliest Neanderthals are not attempts. They are answers. Their features are not halfway stations on the way to something else. They are stable solutions to an equation the Ice Age kept setting. When you see a robust forearm or a broadened nose, you're not witnessing a mistake corrected over time, but a competence that worked for so long it became a tradition written in cartilage and bone. Even as climates swung and ranges shifted, these people endured because their bodies had been tuned by the slow metronome of selection. In warmer interludes, their descendants could stand in green light where elephants splashed in rivers and listen to night insects, and in colder returns they could watch their breath freeze on the fur of animals whose names we will never know. Through both, the form held. It helps to remember that emergence is not a crown placed on a single skull. It is a horizon of variation spreading across countless lives. Somewhere in Central Europe, a child with a slightly thicker brow learned to read the slope of a hillside covered in hoarfrost. Far to the west, a cousin with a broader chest filled their lungs and climbed a ridge to watch herds drift past like weather. Far to the east, another family stood under a sky so cold it hurt to look at, and the older one pointed out a stand of trees that would do, for now, as a windbreak. These are not iconic moments. They are humdrum acts of being alive that, stacked by the tens of thousands, pressed a lineage into a new shape. We can only see it because time hardened those acts into patterns, and then into features that fossilise. When you return to the image of that winter sky, you can also picture summer. Snow fed into torrents, and then fell back into lines of trickle and shadow. Plants that had waited hunched under the surface unfolded in the slanting sun, and browsed hills filled with soft sounds. The same bodies made for cold lived here too, carrying the memory of lean months into days of ease. Growth rings in ancient wood record these alternations. Pollen grains in lake beds stack into barcodes of forest and steppe, whispering about intervals when warmth lingered and then stepped aside. In those windows, early Neanderthals would have seen a spectrum of animals that seems unreal to us now. Forest elephants moved through leaf light in places that feel like grey temperate zones today. Hippos rolled in water that is now a temperate river where commuters cross bridges with coffee in hand. The point is not that the world was kinder, only that it was varied, and this variety also schooled the people who lived inside it. They became generalists in a specialised body, a rare pair of qualities that held them steady for a very long time. We will never know their names. We will never know what they whispered to a child who cried at night, or what they muttered to themselves when a distant crack in the ice sounded like a warning. but the silent record is generous when read with patience. It tells us that between roughly 600,000 and 400,000 years ago, in a climate that tested every tendon of living things, a branch of our shared family took a path into strength and cold craft. It tells us that their skulls changed shape in rhythm with that path, and their bodies answered the terms of their lease on a harsh land. It tells us that emergence here is not a myth of progress, but a story of fit, of how a living form can become a tool fashioned by its own survival. If there is wonder in this, it is a steady one. Not the bright flare of a revelation, but the quiet satisfaction of seeing the pieces line up. You do not need to believe anything more than this to feel respect. Before any later evidence we will encounter further on, before any discussion of tenderness or ceremony, or meeting strangers who would one day become us, there is already enough in the wind and the bone to say that these people belong to their world and made sense inside it. That alone is dignifying. The cold asked questions without words, and their bodies learn to answer. In that light, the emergence of Neanderthals is less an abrupt appearance, and more a long agreeing nod between earth and mind. The land proposed a shape, life accepted. I am only one reader of this record, and like any careful scientist, I am aware of how provisional knowledge can be. New finds in a cave floor or a layer of ancient lake mud can shift timelines or revise details. But within the wide frame that the Middle Pleistocene draws, the picture holds. A different humankind took root under a northern sky and refined itself across many lifetimes until the outline became clear. If you step into that wind for a moment and let your breath frost in the air, you can almost hear it. Not a voice, not yet, but the calm exhale of a body well adapted and the faint scraping of snow under confident feet. If you find calm in deep time, if you drift through these stories while winding down, driving, or just wandering, consider subscribing, leaving a like, or sharing it forward. It helps other tired thinkers find their way back through the dark. Timestamps are below, in case you fall asleep mid-story and want to return later. No hurry. The Ice Age waits, now. Let's follow a trail of footprints through ancient snow, to a moment when two kinds of humans looked across a fire at one another and saw themselves reflected in the flame. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story. Imagine standing on a steppe where winter never truly leaves. The ground is a hard grey skin of frost, the sky a pale silver sheet stretched tight between horizons, and in that breathless stillness a herd of mammoths moves like living hills through the fog. Somewhere nearby, a group of humans crouches low, behind a bank of snow and stone, waiting for the wind to shift. They are not like us exactly, but they are close enough that you would recognize the tension in their bodies, the calculation in their eyes. These are Neanderthals in their prime, masters of the Ice Age, their breath steaming in rhythm with the great beasts they hunt. And though they look carved for strength, what keeps them alive is something far subtler than muscle. It is strategy. Around 300,000 years ago, the world slipped into a climate pattern so severe that it reshaped every living thing that stayed. Europe became a continent of open plains and stunted forests, where the wind polished stones smooth and drove clouds of loess across valleys. Trees retreated to pockets of shelter along rivers. The rest was steppe, an endless stretch of short grass, sedge and ice-hardened soil. Herds of bison, reindeer and wild horses drifted across it like weather systems, followed by predators that learned to match their pace. Neanderthals were among those predators, though the word feels too narrow. They were not scavengers picking at leftovers of lions or hyenas. Isotope traces from their bones tell us they fed at the very top of the food chain. Their bodies, dense and powerful, spoke of lives spent pursuing animals that could kill with a single blow. Every meal had to be earned with precision, cooperation, and the courage to close distance with prey that outweighed them tenfold. Their form was a masterpiece of adaptation. A shorter limb span minimised heat loss. A wide rib cage supported heavy lungs that drew in cold air and warmed it quickly, and their musculature carried more fast twitch fibres than ours, suited for bursts of immense effort. Shoulders set wider, torsos thickened, and hands broadened with bones that read like blueprints for endurance. The world they inhabited rewarded stamina, not sprinting, and when they walked with deliberate economy. It was not a graceful gait, but it was the rhythm of survival. Their skeletons, recovered from caves across Europe and Western Asia, still hold the record of that physical intelligence. Stress marks along clavicles from thrusting spears, healed fractures from encounters with massive prey, layers of mineral in the teeth that grew under a diet of meat and marrow. When we speak of their tools, we're not talking about crude stone. By the Middle Pleistocene, Neanderthals had refined flint knapping into a discipline as practiced and predictable as any modern craft. Archaeologists call it the Mousterian tradition, named for the French cave of Le Moustier where its perfection was first recognised. These tools were the result of forethought. The maker would first imagine the shape of the desired edge, then strike flakes from a core in careful sequence to reveal it. Scrapers, points, and cutting flakes, each one designed for a different purpose, formed a portable toolkit that could turn raw material into shelter, hide, or food. Some sites show piles of rejected flakes where practice and repetition turned failure into understanding. They did not just make tools, they made the act of making into memory. In the cold light of science, what stands out is how these tools connected to hunting. The Neanderthal spear was not thrown from a distance like the later atlatl darts of modern humans. It was meant for close range, a heavy shaft tipped with a carefully shaped point, used in direct confrontation. Wooden spears discovered at Schöningen in Germany, dated to around 300,000 years ago, preserve that legacy. Straight spruce shafts balanced with the precision of a modern javelin, points hardened by fire and crafted to fly true, or to thrust with lethal accuracy. Tests of replicas show they could pierce a target from 20 meters away, but their real strength lay in impact at close quarters. To use one, you had to step near enough to feel the breath of your prey. It is not hard to imagine the strategy. One group driving the herd toward hidden hunters, another circling downwind, all waiting for the right moment. In such hunts, communication did not require language as we know it. A glance, a raised hand, a shift of weight would be enough. They would have learned to read each other's intent from movement alone, the way wolves coordinate without sound. Fossilized bones of horses and bison found in association with Neanderthal tools show repeated trauma patterns. Punctures from thrusting weapons consistent with cooperative ambush rather than random attack. This level of coordination implies planning, trust, and shared risk. Each successful hunt was a statement that intellect had joined force as an equal partner in survival. The reward for that danger was sustenance that few other predators could claim. Chemical isotope analysis of Neanderthal collagen reveals nitrogen signatures typical of apex carnivores, paralleling wolves and big cats. They consumed primarily large herbivores, yet their diet was not monotonous. Remains at sites like Vindiger Cave in Croatia and Spy Cave in Belgium show traces of wild goat, deer, and even occasional plant matter, mosses, mushrooms and nuts, perhaps used as supplements or seasonal necessity. In some cases, burned bones suggest that they roasted meat directly in the embers of a fire, a pragmatic choice in a world where fat was energy and energy meant life. This was not a diet of abundance, but of calculated sufficiency. Each hunt could sustain a group for days. Each loss could starve them. Their camps were temporary worlds stitched together by routine. Imagine them setting up on a ridge where the wind was steady and the view wide. They would arrange stone flakes in small piles, dig shallow hearths, and stack bones to serve as cutting surfaces. A few hides stretched over branch frames might provide windbreaks. Nights were spent near the flames, bodies huddled for warmth, watching sparks rise into air that froze them mid-flight. The soundscape was minimal. The pop of resin in wood, distant howls, the rhythmic breath of those drifting towards sleep. In the morning they would fan out to check the traps, sharpen edges dulled by work, and begin again. To live in such cycles required knowledge not just of the present moment, but of patterns, migration routes, breeding seasons, the behaviour of prey when the wind changed direction. These were maps held not on parchment but in memory. If the physical record speaks of power, the archaeological record whispers of nuance. The way Neanderthals processed animal carcasses suggests selectivity and understanding of anatomy. Cuts on bones follow muscle attachments precisely, reflecting deliberate butchery rather than random hacking. Some skeletons show marrow extraction from long bones, achieved by striking with a stone hammer at just the right point to split the shaft without shattering it completely. This efficiency saved time and preserved tools. They may have stored marrow in cold weather, sealing it in bone for later consumption, a technique used by later hunter-gatherers. Even if we cannot see their thoughts, we can see their problem-solving in the waste they left behind. Picture a hunt in motion. Snow falls sideways across an open plain, reducing visibility to a blur. The herd moves sluggishly through knee-high drifts, breaking trail. Hidden in a shallow gully, 6 Neanderthals wait, bodies tense. One signals, another rises silently and moves to flank. As the animals pass within range, they spring forward, driving heavy spears into the led reindeer. The shock of impact cracks the silence. The animal stumbles, blood steaming in the cold. Another spear finds its mark, and within minutes the herd scatters, leaving 2 bodies behind. There is shouting, short bursts of sound, not random but rhythmic as they coordinate the kill. When it is done, they stand breathing hard, surrounded by the evidence of survival. The scene is violent, yes, but it is also communal. Success here depends on the precision of many working as one. Later, when the meat is divided and the bones cracked for marrow, each participant knows that the same effort will be required tomorrow and the next day. Their resilience was not brute instinct, but practiced skill. Surviving a glacial Europe demanded long-term adaptation to scarcity and unpredictability. The cold was not a temporary season, it was a system. Ice advanced and retreated, erasing forests and drawing lines of hunger across the land. Neanderthals persisted because they treated that instability as normal. They migrated when they had to, sometimes moving hundreds of kilometres along valleys or coasts, following the game that sustained them. Archaeological finds from Gibraltar to the Ural foothills show how widely they spread, yet their tools and methods remain recognisably consistent. The Mousterian culture was not static but shared, a language of stone that bound groups across distance. It is easy for us to imagine the Ice Age as endless struggle, but within it were moments of calm routine. On milder days the sun broke through low clouds, turning frost to diamond dust. Children might have played at chipping pebbles or drawing in ash, adults repairing spears or scraping hides. The simplicity of these tasks hides their importance. Each sharpened edge, each stretched skin, each remembered trail was a thread in the network that kept them alive. To look at a Neanderthal camp is to see an early form of human organisation, specialisation emerging from necessity. Someone better at flint knapping might have focused on tools while another prepared sinew for binding. These are the beginnings of defined roles, not yet hierarchy, but efficiency born of repetition. One can also see evidence of fire mastery. Hearths at sites like Pêche de Lazé in France contain layers of charcoal separated by sediment, proof that fires were built repeatedly in the same places over years or generations. Maintaining fire through a night of wind and snow requires vigilance, fuel management, and foresight. Fire provided warmth, protection from predators, and a way to process food that conserved energy. Its steady glow might also have anchored their social life, a circle of light around which cooperation was renewed. They did not invent fire, but they domesticated its rhythm, turning it into part of their survival architecture. To think of Neanderthals only as strong misses the truth of their success. Strength may start a hunt, but only strategy ends it. Their intelligence was embodied rather than abstract, a thinking done through movement, timing, and craft. Every spear cast, every flake struck from a core was a decision based on pattern recognition, learned through countless trials. Over centuries those patterns became culture. The Mousterian toolkit endured longer than any later technology we have made, a quiet testament to how well it fit its purpose. Longevity like that suggests not stagnation, but perfection. There is humility in acknowledging how little difference separated us from them. When modern researchers reconstruct Neanderthal muscle distribution or analyse wear patterns on teeth, what emerges is not a story of primitive beings, but of a population tuned exquisitely to a demanding world. If they were less visible to us until recently, it is only because time buried their camps under dust and glacier, not because their intelligence was lesser. The same capacity that guided their hunts shaped the stone in their hands and the community at their fires. For hundreds of thousands of years, it was enough. We can stand on a winter field today, close our eyes, and still hear that wind. The air will bite the same way. The snow will squeak underfoot in the same pitch. What has changed is only our context, not the principle. To survive in a harsh world, you learn, adapt, and work together. That was their genius as much as ours. They did not have grocery stores or parkers, no metal blades or permanent homes, yet they mastered a landscape that would test even modern humans with all our tools and machines. They were not an evolutionary misstep, but a successful experiment that lasted far longer than our own species has yet managed. And so, when we find the marks of their spears in the bones of prey or the blackened earth where their fires once burned, we are not looking at evidence of brutality but of balance. They lived within the ice, not against it. Every storm they endured honed their intelligence into something quiet and efficient, something we might call wisdom if we weren't afraid to share that word. Perhaps that is the truest answer to the question. Brute strength kept them alive day to day, but it was mind, steady, observant, communal, that built their endurance across ages of frost. Imagine walking into the earth until the world disappears. The air thickens, light falters, and the silence becomes so complete that even your heartbeat sounds foreign. The entrance fades behind you like a dying star. For most creatures, this would be the end of curiosity, but for someone, nearly 175,000 years ago, it was the beginning of intention. Deep inside what is now the Bruniquel cave in southern France, more than 300 metres from daylight, Neanderthals carried fire into the blackness and built something no one expected. They broke stalagmites from the cave floor, dragged and arranged them into circular rings, and lit their work with flickering torches. The result was two deliberate geometric structures made from over 400 pieces of stone, resting in the dark where no sunlight had ever reached. What drove them there? What need or meaning called them into such a place? No one knows, but the stones remain, an ancient geometry that has waited for us longer than civilization itself. The discovery came by accident. In the early 1990s, Cavers exploring Brunickel's deep tunnels noticed an odd pattern among the stalagmites, fragments stacked and arranged in circular formations. When radiometric dating was first attempted, it returned an almost unbelievable number, older than 170,000 years, long before Homo sapiens ever set foot in Europe. Decades later, a reanalysis using uranium-thorium dating confirmed it. The rings were built by Neanderthals. The finding landed like quiet thunder across archaeology. It meant that far from being creatures of mere survival, Neanderthals could plan, cooperate, and construct in ways previously thought reserved for our own species. To understand the magnitude of this act, imagine the environment they worked in. Brunickel's deep chambers are cold and airless, with humidity close to saturation, and a darkness so complete it bends the sense of space. The floor is uneven, littered with calcite debris, slick with condensation. Moving through such terrain with fire requires not only courage but coordination. Even modern cavers with headlamps and guides feel claustrophobic there. Yet these ancient humans descended carrying only wooden torches. Pieces of wood we know they burned because charred residues still coat parts of the stalagmite rings. They did not wander accidentally into the depth. They returned repeatedly, bringing light and labour to shape the unlit stone. The structures themselves defy simple interpretation. Each ring is built from broken stalagmites ranging in size from child's arm thickness to pieces as long as a man's leg. Some were propped upright, others laid horizontally in deliberate alignment. The larger ring spans about 7 meters across, the smaller one just under 2. They overlap slightly, like linked circles. Additional clusters of stalagmite fragments radiate from them like spokes or piles. This was not random debris, it was construction. The pieces had been snapped from their natural growth positions, transported and balanced to form repeating shapes. Chemical analysis of calcite regrowth on the broken ends confirmed that the breakage and placement occurred around the same time, not through natural collapse. To achieve this, those Neanderthals had to visualize space in 3 dimensions and coordinate as a group. Breaking hundreds of stalagmites is heavy, monotonous work. Even if each individual could only carry a few at a time, assembling that many pieces deep underground meant multiple trips and sustained focus. They needed a stable source of firelight to navigate and to see what they were building, which means they controlled flame long enough to work within it. Small charred fragments of bone and wood near the rings testify that they maintained burning material through the project. It is the earliest direct evidence of humans engineering their environment far below ground. What could have compelled them to do this? We must tread carefully. The temptation to project our imagination onto prehistory is strong, but humility requires restraint. We can describe what is there, circles, symmetry, deliberate movement, fire, but we cannot claim to know why. Perhaps it was practical, an attempt to create a windbreak or an enclosure to shelter near the steady temperature of the cave's depths. But there are problems with that view. The cave's entrance was already sheltered, and the darkness this far in would have made habitation difficult. The structures are also too small and irregular to serve as full walls. They may have been boundaries for something else, places to store or protect something unseen. Some researchers suggest that they could have been part of a system of markers, early architecture of meaning. If that is true, it hints at a mental leap. Geometry, after all, is not an accident of instinct. A circle requires perception of space that loops back on itself, an understanding of closure and repetition. These are cognitive steps toward abstraction, even if the maker never thought of them as such. To decide that certain stones should stand here, arranged just so, implies a model in the mind before the act, and to carry that model into the bowels of the earth, where light fails and echoes distort, is to engage with space in a way that feels almost spiritual, though we cannot call it that with certainty. We know the air must have been alive with sound. Every movement, every dropped rock, every breath reverberated against limestone walls. Torchlight would have cast enormous trembling shadows, doubling the builders in the flicker of flame. Perhaps they moved with caution, their eyes adapting to the gloom, the smell of smoke and wet stone filling their lungs. We can imagine the glow of embers bouncing off pale calcite, turning it copper for a heartbeat. These are not guesses of motive, only reconstructions of experience, sensory echoes preserved in the physical logic of the place. What is undeniable is the planning. Before Bruniquel, archaeologists assumed that Neanderthal activity deep in caves was rare, limited to simple sheltering near entrances. Yet this event shows foresight across stages, selecting a site, bringing tools and fire, organising labour and returning to maintain it. Each of those acts requires a mind capable of sequential thought. The rings were not useful in the immediate way of a spear or scraper, but they required similar technical discipline. In that sense, they blur the boundary between utility and intention. The sheer age of the site also reshapes timelines. At roughly 175,000 years ago, this construction predates any known comparable structure by modern humans. It is twice as old as the earliest recognised cave art, and 4 times older than the first clear signs of architecture above ground. It reminds us that the mental architecture of humanity, the ability to plan, to coordinate, to manipulate space for reasons beyond survival, was present long before our species arrived. If these were experiments in space-making, Neanderthals were conducting them on their own terms, in a darkness they may have found compelling rather than fearful. From a scientific standpoint, Bruniquel offers rare data on controlled fire in deep environments. Charred residues show that they maintained small fires at several points around the rings, likely using bone and wood as fuel. The heat marks on nearby rock suggest temperatures high enough to sustain continuous light for hours. Such control indicates familiarity with both fuel selection and oxygen management in confined spaces, practical chemistry before the concept existed. This was a technological achievement, not an accident of dropped torches. It also hints at communication. To coordinate such work in total darkness, they must have used signals, gestures, sounds, perhaps rudimentary vocalizations. A single worker could not have shaped both circles alone. The scope demands at least a small team. They had to agree on placement, sequence, and design. Cooperation at this scale implies social cohesion and shared purpose. Whether that purpose was ritual, exploration, or construction hardly matters. The teamwork itself is evidence of advanced social intelligence. The deeper meaning of the rings continues to elude us, and maybe that is fitting. When modern scientists first re-entered Bruniquel with electric lamps, they found themselves in awe not just of the preservation but of the feeling. The air seemed heavy, the silence intact. To look at those stalagmites and realise they were arranged by hands like ours, hands that gripped spears, shaped flint, tended fires, is to feel continuity stretching across an abyss of time. They were not visitors to their world. They were its authors in ways we have only begun to recognise. It is humbling to consider that the oldest known construction in human history is not a house, not a temple, not even a hearth, but 2 circles of broken stone in complete darkness. The act feels both practical and poetic, like the first whisper of architecture before language. We may never know what those circles meant to the ones who built them, but we can be sure they meant something. The effort was too great, the setting too specific for it to have been meaningless. Even if the motive has been erased by time, the pattern remains, and pattern is the fingerprint of thought. When we leave the cave in imagination and step back into daylight, we carry that realization with us. that deep inside the earth, Neanderthals had already begun shaping not just tools, but places. They had claimed a space beyond mere survival, altering it in the image of an idea. Maybe it was the feel of enclosure that mattered. A circle of stones reflecting a circle of fire, a brief echo of safety in a world ruled by cold and wind. Or maybe it was something stranger, an early curiosity about the unseen, an instinct to transform chaos into order. Whatever the answer, Bruniquel changes the conversation about what it means to be human. It tells us that the capacity for design, for pattern making, for stepping into darkness and leaving behind structure, did not belong solely to Homo sapiens. It belonged to our shared lineage of thinking beings who looked at the world and saw not just what it was, but what it could become. Perhaps the circles were never meant to last, yet they did. In that endurance is a kind of quiet triumph, proof that the first architects of imagination might have carried torches shaped like ours. I am aware that interpretation always dances on a thin line between evidence and imagination. The data is solid, stalagmite rings, fire residues, dating confirmed, but the meaning remains open, and it should. As any honest scientist admits, each discovery expands what we know only by revealing how much we still do not. The Bruniquel rings do not give us answers. They give us better questions. And perhaps that, more than the structures themselves, is the true measure of intelligence. For curiosity, like fire, only survives when someone dares to carry it into the dark. Imagine this. The Ice Age loosens its grip and Europe blooms. Rivers spill over with lilies, oak forests stretch where tundra once slept, and herds of deer move through shafts of gold light beneath a canopy of green. In what is now southern England, the Thames drifts slow and wide through wetlands where hippos wallow beside elephants, their reflections rippling in warm, pollen-heavy water. Lions lie in tall grass near the shade of birch trees, waiting for the young or the weak to step from the herd. It sounds impossible, like some misplaced chapter from Africa's story, yet around 125,000 years ago, this was Europe. The ice had retreated to the poles, the glaciers were only ghosts on far horizons, and the climate, warmer than today, had transformed the continent into a natural Eden. In that world of green abundance, the Neanderthals thrived. They hunted in woodlands instead of on frozen plains. They fished in rivers that no longer froze and walked through evenings soft with insect hum rather than wind howl. The earth had changed its mood, and they changed with it. The shift into this interglacial, known to science as the Eemian, was not gradual so much as rhythmic. For tens of thousands of years before, the planet had swung through cycles of cold and mild, driven by subtle changes in the tilt of its axis and the shape of its orbit around the sun. Every so often the mathematics of that orbit aligned to bring longer summers to the north, and ice sheets melted back like retreating tides. Around this time, the great white walls that had held Europe in their shadow dissolved, and what followed was a botanical explosion. Fossilized pollen cores from lakes in Germany and France tell the story vividly. First came birch and pine, then hazel and oak, then elm and hornbeam in dense layered forests. Where once Neanderthals had walked among periglacial scrub and dwarf willow, they now moved beneath green roofs that muffled sound and trapped scent. The animals tell the same story. In sediments across Britain, the Netherlands and Central Europe, we find bones of species we associate with the African savannas, hippopotamuses, straight-tusked elephants, even lions. In the river gravels of what is now Trafalgar Square in London, paleontologists have unearthed the remains of hippos that swam in the Thames. Fossil footprints along the ancient Severn Plain include those of elephants and humans, perhaps Neanderthals, pressed side by side into soft mud during some hot summer long before recorded history. The world they knew was no longer locked in frost. It was alive with sound and scent, green and gold. We often picture Neanderthals as creatures of snow and firelight, but this was a season of their story written in warmth. They adapted with quiet efficiency. Their clothing would have thinned, perhaps replaced by light wraps of hide against rain or insects rather than heavy furs. Their shelters, if they built them at all, could be simpler, shaded lean-tos instead of thick windbreaks. Food changed too. Hunting on the open steppe had demanded patience and endurance. Forest hunting required silence and quickness. The prey had changed shape, and so did the strategy. They likely hunted fallow deer and wild boar instead of mammoths, using ambush and stealth rather than pursuit. In the archaeological record, the tools of this time, still part of the Mousterian tradition, show refinement suited to a different landscape. Scrapers and cutting flakes may have been used more often for woodworking or processing softer hides, evidence of a world where wood was plentiful and life less bound by cold. Plant microfossils from dental calculus, tiny traces caught in the plaque of Neanderthal teeth, suggest that they consumed a more varied diet during these warmer millennia, including plant food such as seeds, nuts and tubers. They were not limited to the meat of large animals. This flexibility is what made them resilient. When the world changed, they adjusted their menu, their tools, their rhythms. Picture a Neanderthal family moving through the edge of an oak grove at dusk. The air smells of damp earth and crushed fern. A child carries a branch of berries. Another holds a flint point freshly retouched. A man pauses to listen, perhaps to the rustle of deer hooves, perhaps to something larger, and the group waits in stillness until the sound passes. When they reach a clearing near a riverbank, they kneel by the water to drink, watching the reflection of trees ripple beside the dark bulk of a hippopotamus, half submerged downstream. For a moment, all is calm. Water, leaf, light, and the breathing of humans who have learned again to belong to a living world rather than an icy one. For archaeologists, this period offers an unexpected glimpse into Neanderthal range and adaptability. Sites once thought to mark their northern limits suddenly show activity far into regions that had been uninhabitable during the glacial epochs. In Britain, for example, Neanderthal tools appear in layers associated with warm fauna, showing that they crossed land bridges exposed by low seas and returned when conditions allowed. They were not confined to one climate. They were citizens of a fluctuating Earth. The warmth, however, was temporary. Interglacials are by nature pauses, not endings. Around 115,000 years ago, the climate began to tip once more toward cold. Ice sheets expanded from Scandinavia, sea levels fell, and forests shrank northward or collapsed into isolated pockets along river valleys. Pollen diagrams show a retreat from dense woodland to steppe-like open terrain in a matter of centuries, an ecological blink. The elephants and hippos vanished first, replaced by cold-adapted species, reindeer, woolly rhinoceroses, and steppe bison. For the Neanderthals, it meant another pivot. What stands out is how seamlessly they seem to have made that transition. Evidence from layers spanning the end of the Eemian into the next glaciation shows no catastrophic collapse in their numbers or culture. They simply shifted, following the herds as they moved south or adapting to the returning cold. Stone tool assemblages remain consistent, implying that their technological base was broad enough to work across multiple environments. Their knowledge of fire, their social bonds, and their cooperative hunting habits all prove transferable. The same minds that had tracked deer through forest shadows now tracked reindeer across frost plains. Yet one can imagine the sensory shock of that change. A Neanderthal born into the green wealth of interglacial Europe would, by adulthood, have seen the forest thin, the rivers shrink, and the world harden under frost again. The songs of frogs and insects would fade, replaced by wind through bare branches. The return of the cold would not be sudden, but it would be inexorable, and each generation would feel a little more distance from the lush past. In that slow transformation there is a lesson about continuity. They did not cling to the memory of warmth. They met the cold with the same patience that had seen them through a dozen shifts before. During these cycles, Europe was a laboratory of adaptation. The Eemian interglacial was not the only warm pulse in the Neanderthal story, but it was among the most dramatic. It reminds us that their evolution was not tied to one set of conditions. They were shaped by instability itself. Their survival across hundreds of thousands of years meant learning to read the language of change, the taste of air before frost, the migration routes of deer before drought, the feel of soil underfoot as it shifted from soft loam to permafrost. They were masters not of ice or of sun, but of transition. The fossils of animals from this time are startling in their testimony. At Swanscombe in Britain, fragments of elephant bone lie beside Mousterian tools. At Neumark Nord in Germany, layers of sediment show alternating horizons of warm forest fauna and cooler species, with traces of human activity in both. In northern France, bones of hippos have been found in deposits rich with pollen from aquatic plants, painting a vivid picture of a riverine landscape teeming with life. Through all of it, Neanderthal presence persists. Footprints of fire use, stone flakes, butchered animal remains. Quiet markers of their continuity through environmental revolution. One cannot help but smile at the strangeness of it all. Hippos in Britain, elephants grazing where London now sprawls, Neanderthals walking through meadows beneath summer skies. If a time traveller from the Ice Age could visit that warmth, they might have felt disoriented by abundance. And yet, abundance brings its own challenges. Hunting large animals in dense forest demands stealth and speed. Meat spoils quickly in the heat. Parasites multiply. The skill set that made sense on the steppe had to be rewritten for the forest. They did it without complaint, without ceremony, simply because the world required it. When the ice began its slow return, the forest receded like a dream. Step by step, the continent quieted. Rivers shrank back into narrow channels, trees yielded to grass, and dust began to blow again across the plains. By 100,000 years ago, Europe was once more a land of cold winds and wandering herds. For Neanderthals, it was familiar territory. They had seen this cycle before, perhaps more than once within living memory. The young would have heard elders speak of the time when the woods were thick and the rivers wide, when the air smelled of flowers instead of frost. But the new generation grew up under a different sun, one pale and thin, and they adapted their expectations as naturally as breath. When we study their bones and the sediments that hold them, we can see in them the rhythm of Earth itself. Warmth, growth, contraction, cold, a heartbeat stretching over tens of millennia. Through all of it, Neanderthals endured. They were not merely creatures of one climate, but witnesses to many. Their persistence across these oscillations makes them one of nature's most successful experiments in flexibility. It is humbling to think that while modern humanity has lived through only a handful of major climate shifts, the Neanderthals survived dozens. Each time the world offered paradise, they walked in it without illusion, and when the cold came roaring back, they faced it without despair. Perhaps that is their greatest legacy, the ability to live in rhythm with change rather than against it. For them, Eden was not a permanent state, but a passing season, to be used and remembered, not mourned. And when the warmth ended, they did what they had always done. They gathered their tools, followed the herds, and kept moving forward. What if I told you that long before our species painted caves or carved ivory, another kind of human was already collecting beauty from the world? Picture it. An eagle's talon glinting orange in firelight, its tip worn smooth not from hunting but from touch. A handful of seashells rubbed with red ochre and threaded together with sinew. A fragment of deer bone carved with zigzag lines that serve no practical purpose, except perhaps to mean something. Each of these objects was found far from the sea or the sky that birthed them, carried and shaped by Neanderthal hands between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. They are the oldest known artifacts of meaning in Europe, and they whisper that symbolism, that quiet habit of seeing the world as more than it appears, did not begin with us. The story begins in what is now Croatia, in a limestone shelter above the Krapina River. Excavated more than a century ago, the site is rich with the bones of Neanderthals and the animals they lived among. But among the flint flakes and fragments of hearth lay 8 eagle talons, each one bearing tiny, deliberate cut marks where the claw was separated from the foot. The talons' surfaces are polished, not by nature, but by handling, perhaps by rubbing against skin or sinew cord. They date to around 130,000 years ago, a time when no Homo sapiens had yet entered Europe. The simplest explanation, and the most profound, is that someone strung them together as an ornament, a necklace perhaps, or a bracelet. Jewellery made not for function, but for identity. To take something from a raptor, a creature of the heights, and wear it on your own body is a gesture of transformation. It suggests pride, admiration, even reverence. The people of Krapina, it seems, decorated themselves long before decoration had a name. Far to the southwest, in the caves of Iberia, another layer of evidence waited patiently beneath stalagmite crusts. In the Cueva de los Aviones near Cartagena, and in the cave of Cueva Anton further inland, archaeologists uncovered perforated seashells stained with vivid red and yellow pigments. One still contained traces of hematite and goethite, the mineral basis of ochre, mixed into what may have been a paint or cosmetic paste. The layers enclosing them are more than 100,000 years old. The nearest coastline, then, was several kilometres away, meaning someone had gone to collect these shells, carried them inland, and treated them as valuable objects. They were not tools or food, they were symbols. To paint a shell red is to transform it from natural to intentional, from found to made. Whether these shells were worn as pendants, used as containers for pigment, or kept as personal tokens, they suggest a capacity for abstraction, that to assign meaning beyond function. If we walked into that cave one evening, we might have seen a Neanderthal crouch beside a fire, grinding ochre into powder with a stone, then dipping a fingertip into the colour and tracing it across the smooth curve of a shell. Perhaps the act was practical, a marker of ownership or status, or perhaps it was purely aesthetic, the joy of turning earth into colour. Whatever the reason, it required imagination, a mind that could envision transformation. These discoveries challenge the neat boundary we once drew between survival and expression. For much of the 20th century, archaeologists assume that symbolism, the making of art, the wearing of adornments, the creation of abstract marks, belonged solely to modern humans. Neanderthals were cast as imitators, capable of shaping stone but not ideas. Yet the more we uncover, the more that story crumbles. The objects speak otherwise. The most striking example came recently from a German cave known as Einhornhöhle, or Unicorn Cave. There, among layers dated to around 51,000 years ago, a team of researchers uncovered a piece of deer bone unlike any other. On one face, 5 deep, deliberate lines form a chevron pattern, sharp-edged, evenly spaced, unmistakably intentional. Microscopic analysis showed that the marks were carved after the bone had been softened, meaning the maker prepared the material in advance. It was not butchery, not an accident of cutting meat from bone. It was carving, slow, controlled and precise. The tool marks overlap in a rhythmic sequence, suggesting repetition, even pattern recognition. It is the oldest known example of figurative engraving in Europe, and it was made by a Neanderthal. When the bone was first shown to the public, it provoked an uneasy excitement. Could this really be art? Or is it something simpler, a bored hand passing time? But art begins somewhere between boredom and meaning. To carve a line that serves no purpose other than to exist is to acknowledge the power of symbol. Whether it stood for something known or for nothing at all, it marked a moment when thought became visible. If we add these clues together, the talons, the shells, the carved bone, we begin to see a pattern of minds capable of abstraction. Not every Neanderthal made such things, and not every group left traces of pigment or ornament, but scattered across tens of thousands of years, the pattern repeats. In some sites, lumps of ochre appear near hearths, their surfaces ground smooth as if used for colouring. In others, black manganese nodules crushed into powder show signs of use far from any practical necessity. Some pigments might have been used for camouflage, others for body paint or decoration of objects. Either way, these acts require deliberate thought, to seek colour in the earth and to use it as expression. Imagine for a moment a Neanderthal sitting near a fire, holding a fragment of ochre in one hand and a feather in the other. The light catches the red dust on their fingers. Around them, the night hums with the sounds of insects and the crackle of wood. Perhaps they draw a line on their arm, or on the smooth wall of a nearby rock. No one else may ever see it, but for a brief moment that line means something. An idea, a memory, a way of saying, "This is mine," or "This is beautiful," without words. Even ravens may have inspired them. At sites such as Fumain in Italy and Zaskalnaya in Crimea, researchers have found bird bones with precise cut marks, suggesting feathers were plucked not for meat, but for their glossy sheen. Black feathers from ravens and raptors may have been collected as ornaments, their iridescent surfaces glinting like mirrors in the sun. The act of selecting them shows discrimination, a preference for colour, texture, and pattern. It is the same kind of selectivity that underlies art, the eye choosing what the world does not require. To appreciate these clues properly, we must recognise their rarity. Organic materials decay, pigments fade. For every talon or shell that survived, there may have been hundreds that did not. What we see is only the durable tip of a much larger iceberg of expression. If the physical evidence has lasted this long, the mental capacity behind it likely lasted even longer. What these objects also reveal is that Neanderthals were not static. Their culture evolved, diversified, and perhaps even regionalised. The eagle talons of Croatia differ from the shell ornaments of Iberia, which differ again from the engraved bone of Germany. Each represents an independent flowering of creative behaviour. That independence is crucial. It suggests these were not borrowed habits learned from others, but original ideas arising from within their own populations. When Homo sapiens later arrived in Europe, they encountered a people who already understood the logic of symbol, who already saw the world through a lens of possibility. The meaning of these artifacts will always remain open to interpretation. Were they tokens of status, charms for luck, or the earliest gestures of aesthetic curiosity? The evidence allows for all and confirms none. Yet the repetition of symbolic acts across time and space implies consistency, a shared mental architecture. To make something beautiful or meaningful requires not only dexterity, but imagination. The Neanderthals had both. It is worth pausing to consider what art really means in this context. To us, it conjures galleries, intention, and commentary. To them, it may have been something far simpler, a way of connecting with the tangible world. A coloured shell, a polished claw, a carved bone, each an experiment in turning matter into message. And while we may never decode the message, its existence tells us that meaning itself is older than we imagined. A quiet truth hides in this timeline. By 50,000 years ago, Neanderthals were not only enduring the Ice Age but thinking beyond it. They looked at the world and saw possibility, not just for survival, but for beauty. That shift is immense. It marks the moment when the mind begins to turn inward, to invent purpose where none is demanded. It is, in essence, the dawn of imagination. And yes, perhaps we can smile at the idea. The first jewellery designer in Europe was not Homo sapiens but Neanderthalensis. Eagle talon chic, as one archaeologist once joked. Yet beneath that humour lies something profound. To craft adornment is to say, I am more than my needs. It is to assert identity in a universe that does not ask for it. The fact that we can still see those talons, those shells, that carved bone, means the assertion worked. They spoke, in the language of pattern, pigment and polish, across 100 millennia. I do not claim to know exactly what stirred in their minds when they strung talons or painted shells. No scientist can. But the objects remain as evidence of thought reaching beyond hunger and shelter into the realm of idea. They remind us that art did not arrive suddenly with us. It evolved quietly, stone by stone, gesture by gesture, in the hands of those we once called other. When they shaped colour and form, they were shaping something even larger, the concept of self. What if I told you that if you could sit by a Neanderthal fire 60,000 years ago, you might hear something that sounds almost human? A voice, warm and deep, echoing through a limestone cave. Not a grunt, not a growl, but a cascade of syllables rising and falling with rhythm. You might not understand the words, but you would recognize the music of communication. Tone, pause, laughter. For a long time, the idea that Neanderthals could speak was treated as a fantasy of empathy. But science, as it turns out, has been quietly tuning its ear to the past. The first clue lay buried in a cave on the slopes of Mount Carmel in what is now Israel. There, in Kibera Cave, excavators uncovered the almost complete skeleton of a Neanderthal male who had died roughly 60,000 years ago. Among the preserved bones was something small but revolutionary, a hyoid bone, the tiny horseshoe-shaped structure that anchors the tongue and supports the muscles of the throat. In us, this bone is essential for articulate speech. It forms part of the system that allows words to be shaped by air, tongue, and intention. For decades, researchers had wondered whether Neanderthals had one like it, or whether their throats were built only for rough vocalizations. The Kibera hyoid answered the question almost too neatly. It was virtually identical to our own. Its shape and position implied that Neanderthals had a larynx capable of producing a similar range of sounds, vowels and consonants, modulated airflow, perhaps even tone. CT scans and biomechanical modelling showed that it could have functioned the same way as in modern humans. This was not a creature limited to grunts. They had the physical architecture for speech, a descended larynx, a tongue and lips coordinated by muscle precision, and a skull base angled to accommodate vocal resonance. Their rib cages even suggest they had fine control over breath, which is vital for producing sustained sentences or songs. Still, anatomy alone cannot prove language. Parrots can mimic speech without understanding it. So scientists turn to genetics, the blueprints behind our ability to communicate. Among the many genes that influence speech and language, one stands out, FOXP2. Mutations in this gene in humans cause profound difficulties in forming sentences and controlling articulation. When the Neanderthal genome was sequenced, researchers found that they shared with us the same critical version of FOXP2 that modern humans possess. Not a primitive precursor, not a halfway step, but the same molecular code. This implies that the neural circuits supporting syntax, motor control and auditory feedback were already established in our shared ancestor, and Neanderthals inherited them intact. Combined, the anatomical and genetic evidence builds a compelling picture. Their throats could speak, their brains could process speech, and their genes coded for the wiring that made it possible. In other words, they had the machinery for language, and it would be strange to imagine nature maintaining such complexity for no reason. Evolution rarely invests in useless precision. If Neanderthals could speak, they likely did. What might their voices have sounded like? Computer models reconstructing Neanderthal vocal tracts suggest that their range of pitch and timbre was close to ours, perhaps a bit deeper on average due to their robust chests and broader throats. Their faces, shorter and more forward set, would have shaped sound differently, giving them a nasal richness or resonance unfamiliar to us. Some researchers propose that their speech may have leaned towards slower, more rhythmic phrasing, possibly with fewer sharply contrasting vowels. But these are nuances. The core fact remains. To the human ear, they would not have sounded alien. If a Neanderthal had called across a valley, the echo might have fooled you into thinking it was another person. This possibility transforms how we imagine their lives. A creature capable of speech can share knowledge in ways no silent species can. Around a fire, an older Neanderthal might have explained how to strike flint or shape a spear point, not just by showing, but by describing, using words for materials, actions, and sequences. Teaching becomes easier when it can be spoken. A hunt can be planned with strategy rather than intuition. Warning cries can distinguish between danger in the trees and danger on the plain. Most importantly, conversation allows community, gossip, comfort, even humour. It's easy to picture the scene. A group gathered near the mouth of a cave, flames flickering against stone, wind moaning outside. A child fumbles with a tool, and an elder speaks, slowly, clearly, repeating the sounds until the motion clicks. A rhythm of instruction and understanding passes between them. Somewhere nearby, two hunters share a brief exchange, perhaps teasing one another about a missed throw earlier that day. Someone laughs. The sound is soft, familiar, entirely human. Their capacity for language also implies memory and storytelling. Words allow us to name things that are not present, to recall hunts long past or to warn of places haunted by predators. To name something is to claim power over it. If Neanderthals could name, they could organize their world in concepts, grouping animals, tools, and individuals into categories that could be shared. The ability to refer to absent objects or people, to speak of the past or imagine the future, is the seed of imagination itself. It also hints at the birth of culture, since shared language allows traditions to persist across generations. Even their ears confirm this story. Studies of Neanderthal ear canals and middle ear bones reveal that their hearing range was tuned to the same frequencies as human speech, roughly 2 to 5 kilohertz. That's the range where the most important consonant sounds live, the clicks, snaps, and stops that differentiate one word from another. This auditory sensitivity suggests they both produced and understood complex vocalizations. In essence, their biology was tuned for dialogue. For years, skeptics argued that large brains alone did not equal linguistic sophistication. But the structure of the Neanderthal brain, reconstructed from endocasts, natural moulds formed by the inside of skulls, shows an expanded region corresponding to Broca's area and the auditory association cortex. In us, these regions handle syntax and comprehension. While Neanderthal brain shapes differ, they were certainly capable of processing language-like information. If the brain is an instrument, theirs had all the strings. The implications ripple outward. Language is not merely a tool of communication, it is a scaffold for thought. It allows the mind to hold multiple ideas, to compare and contrast, to invent metaphors. If Neanderthals spoke, then their inner world, their dreams, memories and fears, may have been narrated by an inner voice not so different from ours. They could have comforted a crying child with murmured reassurance, or told a companion where the reindeer would migrate when the snow melted. They might even have sung. That last idea may sound fanciful, but music is often the byproduct of a brain wired for rhythm and vocal expression. The same breath control and pitch modulation used in speech can easily spill into melody. Archaeologists have found a flute-like object made from the thigh bone of a bear at a site once inhabited by Neanderthals in Slovenia, the so-called Divya Babe flute. While debate continues over whether it was deliberately carved or gnawed by animals, its existence fuels a tantalizing possibility that these ancient people played, hummed or sang for reasons beyond survival. To think that a Neanderthal could have sung beneath the dripping ceiling of a cave is to glimpse continuity across a chasm of time. The same air that vibrated in their throats vibrates in ours. Perhaps their lullabies were simple, perhaps their words lacked our grammar, but the emotional intent, comfort, warning, affection, would have been instantly recognizable. Language is, after all, more than words. It is breath turned into understanding. And yet, caution is healthy. We do not have recordings, only bones and genes and the echoes of pattern. There may have been limits to their language. Smaller vocabularies, less abstraction, fewer layers of metaphor. But to measure communication only by its complexity is to miss the miracle that it existed at all. What matters is that they were not silent. Silence is the mark of separation, speech is the bridge across it. Every new discovery erodes the caricature of Neanderthals as mute brutes. The hyoid bone, the FOXP2 gene, the hearing range, the brain architecture, each clue adds resonance to their voices. They were not growling animals in the dark. They were people who spoke to one another, who shared, argued, laughed, and perhaps even sang. The simplest human act, to speak and be understood, connects us across 100 millennia. If we could stand unseen at the edge of one of their camps and listen, we might hear the first faint murmur of language evolving into culture. We would hear continuity, not contrast. And perhaps, if one of them turned toward us and called out, the voice would strike us with an eerie familiarity, not as a relic of the past, but as an echo of ourselves. Imagine this. The tide has gone out, leaving a stretch of damp sand glistening under a grey northern sky. Wind brushes across the dunes, carrying the faint cry of seabirds. Along the shore, a group of humans walks, barefoot, steady, purposeful. Their feet press into the soft mud, leaving perfect impressions. Arches, toes, the curve of a heel. For a brief time they pass together, adults, adolescents, and children, and then they're gone. The wind shifts. A new storm rolls in. Layers of sand bury their prints, sealing the moment away for 80,000 years. They could never have known that one day someone would find them, that one day their morning walk by the sea would become the oldest family portrait in Europe. The discovery came at a place called Le Rosel, a small coastal site in Normandy, France, where cliffs and dunes meet the English Channel. It is an unassuming landscape, pale sands, scrubby grasses, the distant thump of waves. But beneath those dunes lies a miracle of preservation. In 2012, archaeologists led by Jeremy Duveau began excavating what they thought were ancient windblown sediments. What they uncovered instead was the faint geometry of feet, 102 footprints pressed into what had once been wet beach sand. When dating placed them around 80,000 years old, it became clear whose feet they were. Neanderthals had walked here. Each print is a signature of movement and body. Some are small, only 12 centimetres long. Children's feet, soft and still growing. Others are larger, belonging to adolescents or adults. Many are so sharply detailed that you can see individual toes and skin folds. The prints cross and overlap, meandering in gentle arcs that suggest a slow pace, not a chase or a flight. They were not running from predators or hunting prey. They were simply walking, maybe following the shoreline, maybe gathering shellfish, maybe just moving camp from one patch of dunes to another. In that simple act lies the rarest thing archaeology can give us, a moment that feels alive. From the pattern and spacing of the footprints, scientists could estimate the composition of the group. At least 10 to 13 individuals moved together, an unusually precise snapshot of a Neanderthal social unit. About half were children or adolescents, the rest adults. That proportion alone tells us something remarkable. This was not a hunting party of males, nor a solitary pair, but a family group. In their presence we glimpse the rhythm of daily life, cooperation, movement, care. For every adult footstep there are smaller ones weaving beside it, as if little legs were hurrying to keep up. Some impressions sink deeper than others, suggesting that one or more individuals were carrying heavy loads, perhaps gathered shells, stone tools, or even a child. The ground they walked on was soft, a mixture of sand and silt left by the receding tide, so each step required effort. Some prints tilt inward, evidence of turning or shifting direction mid-walk. One set of tiny footprints veers away briefly before rejoining the group, as if the owner had been distracted. By a crab, maybe, or the sparkle of water pooled between ripples. In that faint detour lies something universal. The curiosity of youth. Even 80 millennia ago, toddlers wandered off. The tracks at Le Roselle are not fossilised in the sense of stone. They're impressions preserved by geological luck. The original sand layer was quickly covered by another during a period of rapid dune formation. Over time, compression and mineralisation hardened them just enough to endure. To excavate them today, researchers use delicate brushes and wooden tools, documenting each print with 3D scanning before exposure to air destroys it. It is slow, reverent work, archaeology as translation, reading gestures written in sediment. The prints are not the only traces at the site. Layers above and below hold stone flakes and animal bones, evidence that Neanderthals returned here repeatedly over thousands of years. The landscape would have been different then, cooler, perhaps a mosaic of dunes, marsh and grassland, with the sea line slightly farther away. But even so, the same rhythm likely persisted, gathering, walking, resting, and watching children play along the water's edge. The dunes of Le Roselle were home, if only for a season. If we reconstruct the scene, it might look something like this. Morning light filters through mist. An adult male leads the way along a narrow sandbar, spear balanced on his shoulder. 2 adolescents follow, dragging pieces of driftwood. Behind them, a woman carries a bundle wrapped in hide, and near her side a small child skips between footprints, half running, half stumbling. Another child stops to poke at something glimmering in a puddle, a shell, a crab, a reflection, until a quiet call from behind urges them forward. The air smells of salt and seaweed. The surf murmurs. In the distance, gulls circle where the tide has exposed the remains of a beached whale. The group continues, leaving only the rhythm of their steps behind. That rhythm, the spacing and cadence of footprints, speaks volumes about movement and coordination. Analysis shows that the adults walked with steady, deliberate strides, averaging about 1 metre apart. The children's strides are shorter and more erratic, consistent with a group walking at a communal pace. There are no signs of panic, no scatter of running prints, no deep impressions from sudden stops. Everything about the arrangement suggests calm purpose. They were travelling together as a unit, not as isolated individuals. To study footprints is to study bodies in motion, and from motion one can infer emotion. We can tell from the prints that the ground was damp but firm, neither slogging mud nor dry sand. This means the tide had recently receded, exposing the beach in that brief window of walkable surface. Perhaps they came down to forage at low tide, searching for shellfish, edible plants, or stranded animals. The coastal diet of Neanderthals was richer than we once believed, and La Roselle offers a plausible setting for such foraging trips. They may have carried baskets or hides to hold what they gathered, each step pressed into sand that would later cradle their memory. The presence of so many children challenges old stereotypes about Neanderthal life being purely about survival and strength. These footprints are domestic in nature. They show that families, not just hunters, moved through the landscape. Children were not hidden away in caves or left behind. They were part of the daily rhythm. This reveals a social fabric far closer to our own, one built on teaching, companionship, and the slow transmission of knowledge. The youngest footprints measure barely larger than those of a modern 3-year-old. Imagine that. A child of 3, barefoot, walking beside elders along a cold northern coast. To modern sensibilities it seems harsh, but for them it was life as normal. The world was their classroom, and the sea their teacher. To learn how to find food, they had to see it, touch it, feel it. Those small feet in the sand are a fossilized lesson in resilience. For a scientist, it is rare to find behavior so directly recorded. Bones and tools tell us what a species was capable of. Footprints tell us what they actually did. They're a living record of coordination and belonging. When we stand in front of them today, laid bare under the Normandy sky, it is hard not to feel the strange tug of continuity. Our own beach walks, the footprints we leave behind before the tide erases them, are part of the same pattern. At La Roselle, the prints stretch across several metres, fading into a patch of sediment where wind erosion has taken the rest. It is as if the group simply disappeared over the next dune, continuing their day. And perhaps they did. There is no tragedy frozen here, no hint of catastrophe, just a small window into ordinary time, which in archaeology is rarer than any golden mask or buried treasure. Ordinary life is what leaves the faintest traces, yet it tells us the most about who we were. Even their footprints are subtly different from ours, shaped by their anatomy. Neanderthal feet were wider, with stronger toes and flatter arches, well suited for gripping uneven ground. The prints show that distribution clearly, the big toe slightly more aligned with the others than in a modern human. It is a reminder that difference does not mean distance. They were built for their world, as we are for ours. In studying these tracks, scientists found themselves using words normally reserved for art: composition, rhythm, narrative. The footprints form not just a map, but a story frozen mid-sentence. You can trace where one adult paused briefly, weight shifting, perhaps to look back or wait for another. You can see where a child moved ahead, impatient. The sand holds their personalities more vividly than any skeleton ever could. And in those faint arcs of motion lies a subtle kind of poetry. Every footprint is a decision, a moment of weight, contact, balance, release. When we string them together, they become choreography. The Neanderthal at Le Roselle danced across the shore in patterns we can still read, and in doing so they left behind a testament to the ordinary grace of existence. If there is humour to be found here, and there always is in the human story, it might be in that one small print that veers wildly to the side, crosses another track and then stops abruptly. Perhaps a child chasing a crab, perhaps a stumble in excitement, perhaps a distraction as timeless as any toddler's curiosity. Even 80,000 years ago, some things never changed. Standing in that same coastal wind today, it's easy to feel their presence. Not as distant ancestors, but as neighbours from another time, their laughter carried away by the same sea breeze. The tide has erased them and preserved them all at once. Beneath layers of sand and time they still walk, a family of humans on an ancient beach, leaving the most fragile kind of immortality. Footprints that will, for a little longer, refuse to fade. Imagine this. The wind howls through a narrow mountain valley, snow swirling like smoke. Inside a shallow cave, a fire glows low, its light flickering over a huddled figure. A man lies against the rock wall, his arm missing below the elbow, his ribs broken long ago, one eye clouded white and useless. His breathing is slow but steady. Near him, someone crouches, a woman perhaps, pressing damp moss against a wound, whispering soft rhythmic sounds that are half comfort, half ritual. The air smells of smoke, marrow, and wet fur. In the background, others stir the fire, passing pieces of cooked meat from hand to hand. No one leaves him. No one looks away. In a time before words for mercy, this is what compassion looked like. The man was real. He lived around 50,000 years ago in what is now northern Iraq, in Shanidar Cave, a massive limestone chamber overlooking a dry river valley. His bones, excavated in the mid-20th century and known to science as Shanidar 1, tell a story that reads more like a medical record than an archaeological report. He had suffered a crushing blow to the left side of his skull, likely blinding or impairing his vision. His right arm had been amputated above the elbow, probably from a violent accident or animal attack. Several ribs were healed after being fractured. His right foot and leg showed signs of chronic infection and arthritis, and the bones of his spine were deformed by age and stress. Yet he lived well into his 40s, an advanced age in the Pleistocene world. There is only one possible explanation. His people cared for him. For years, scholars debated whether such care was deliberate compassion or mere practicality, a way to keep a group member alive for labour or social cohesion. But the evidence speaks quietly against cynicism. Shanidar 1's disabilities would have made him nearly useless in hunting or gathering. His blindness, missing limb, and chronic pain meant he required constant assistance. Food brought to him, warmth maintained, protection ensured. His survival was not beneficial to the group in any utilitarian sense. It was sustained empathy, an understanding, instinctual or emotional, that life was worth preserving even when it demanded sacrifice. Archaeologists from the University of York have gone further, analysing a wide range of Neanderthal remains and concluding that healthcare among them was knowledgeable, competent, and compassionate. They note healed fractures, set bones, and signs of infection treated before death. Some individuals show evidence of surviving injuries that, without intervention, would have been fatal. At La Ferracie in France, one skeleton bears a neatly healed broken leg, set straight and aligned as if splintered. Others show teeth worn down not from use but from being fed soft, chewed food after dental loss. These were not isolated gestures of care. They were systemic behaviours passed through generations. One of the most famous examples is the Old Man of La Chapelle-aux-Saints, discovered in the early 1900s in a small limestone depression in central France. He was elderly by Neanderthal standards, over 40 years old, and his skeleton reads like a ledger of hardship. Severe arthritis had twisted his spine and pelvis. He had lost nearly all his teeth, the sockets reabsorbed into bone. And yet, his bones show no sign of starvation. He lived long after his mouth failed him, which means someone chewed his food. Someone softened it, fed it to him, and kept him alive through years of pain. When modern scientists revisited his remains with updated techniques, they confirmed what early observers had only guessed. This was not accidental survival, it was caregiving. Around him, other members of his group had likely adjusted tasks, shared resources, and changed behaviours to accommodate him. A society where that could happen is a society that values its individuals, not because they are useful, but because they belong. We might imagine such scenes by firelight. A hunter injured by a falling stone is carried home by companions. They clean his wound with water warmed over coals, cover it with moss or chewed leaves, bind it with hide. Someone stays awake that night to keep the fire burning. Another brings marrow-rich broth. Over days the wound closes. The patient lives. It is not modern medicine, but it is medicine all the same, and it is medicine powered by empathy. When researchers examine the bones of Neanderthals, they are struck by how often healing appears. Rib fractures, skull trauma, dislocated joints, amputations, all showing signs of long-term recovery. This is the signature of a people who did not abandon the wounded. It suggests a cultural expectation of mutual care, a social safety net made of warmth, labour and time. The hearth, then, was not only a source of heat, it was a hospital, a refuge, a gathering place where healing happened one meal, one night, one gesture at a time. Perhaps the key to Neanderthal healthcare was their fire mastery. Firelight allowed nighttime tending, warmth prevented hypothermia, smoke helped deter insects from wounds, and heated stones may have been used to soothe pain. In the Shanidar cave context, researchers even found traces of plant residues suggesting the possible use of wild herbs, though whether for medicine or food remains uncertain. Still, the pattern is unmistakable. These were people who did not let suffering go unanswered. It is easy to forget how radical that is. In the harshness of the Ice Age, survival was costly. Every mouth to feed reduced the calories available to others. Yet Neanderthals consistently invested in the sick and the frail. The logic was not economic, it was emotional, or perhaps something even older than emotion. Cooperation is evolution's oldest strategy. Long before empathy had a word, it was a behaviour, one that increased the chances of the group's survival. Yes, but also of its meaning. In the soft light of a hearth, one can imagine conversations, maybe not in words we'd recognise, but in tone and rhythm, in gestures and shared silences. The injured might gesture gratitude or hum, or simply meet another's eyes. Bonds were formed there, forged not by dominance, but by care. Each healed scar became a story of someone who stayed. Archaeologists note that the frequency of healed trauma among Neanderthals exceeds that of other carnivores or even early Homo species. This pattern suggests an organised form of mutual aid, not random kindness. In some cases, individuals were kept alive long after they could contribute materially. That persistence reshapes how we think about intelligence. Empathy is not a luxury of advanced minds. It is one of their hallmarks. To recognise another's suffering and respond to it, that is the cognitive leap that blurs the line between survival and society. There is a quiet beauty in imagining the nightly ritual of care. firelight dancing on the walls, someone stirring marrow broth thickened with crushed roots, someone else cleaning a wound with a tuft of moss soaked in water, the patient lying near the warmth, half asleep, listening to familiar voices, the sound of belonging. It is as human a scene as any in history, and it happened tens of thousands of years before we thought such tenderness existed. Of course, we must admit what we don't know. We cannot prove that these acts were motivated by emotion in the way we understand it. We cannot reconstruct the inner life of a Neanderthal tending a wound, but bones do not lie. Someone helped, again and again. Across Europe and Western Asia, wherever their remains are found, traces of healed injury repeat the same refrain. Care was given and received. Whether born of love, duty, or instinct, the result is the same: survival through compassion. This realization reframes not just Neanderthals but ourselves. We often define humanity by art, by speech, by technology. But perhaps the truer measure lies here, in how we treat those who cannot fend for themselves. In that sense, Neanderthals passed the test long before we did. Their hearths were not just fires for warmth. They were circles of empathy, early sanctuaries of medicine and meaning. And maybe, when night fell and the wind moaned outside, someone added one more branch to the fire, leaned close to the wounded and murmured a sound, soft, rhythmic, familiar, not for healing alone, but for comfort. In that sound, whatever it was, echoes the earliest pulse of what we still call care. Imagine this. Deep inside a cave, where the air is still and cold, a small circle of figures kneels by the faint glow of a torch. The firelight flickers across the walls, dancing over stone tools and shadows of faces. In the centre, a body lies curled, knees drawn toward the chest, the head resting gently to one side. Hands move slowly, silently, scooping earth, placing stones, tucking the body in as if against the chill. Someone lingers longer than the rest, holding a small sprig of flowers or pine, unsure why, only that it feels right to leave something behind. The torch sputters once, and the cave returns to darkness. For 50,000 years that darkness will hold their memory. The story of Neanderthal burial begins, like many of their stories, in the caves of Europe and the Near East, places that preserved both their lives and their losses. One of the earliest and most haunting discoveries came from La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France in the early 1900s. There, a nearly complete skeleton was found in a shallow pit carved into the limestone floor. The body lay in a fetal position, protected by a small wall of rocks, its bones undisturbed by scavengers. For the archaeologists who uncovered it, the conclusion seemed clear. This was not a random deposition. Someone had dug this grave and placed the body inside. It was, in essence, a funeral. At the time, this idea shocked the scientific world. The Neanderthals were still widely regarded as primitive, brutish cave dwellers, incapable of abstract thought or emotional depth. The notion that they buried their dead, and perhaps even mourned them, threatened that entire picture. And yet, as more sites emerged, La Ferracie, Regordu, Shanidar, the evidence grew too consistent to ignore. Bodies were not left where they fell. They were arranged, protected, and sometimes adorned. In La Ferracie, France, archaeologists uncovered a striking pattern of graves that spanned generations. The remains of adults and children were found close together, each in a shallow pit carefully positioned. One adult male lay with a large stone slab covering his skull, perhaps intentionally placed to mark the site. Nearby, the skeleton of a small child had been covered with sediment in a deliberate even layer. These details are not the result of chance or natural burial. They are signs of human choice. Across the site, the graves repeat a rhythm, a recurring act of care in the face of loss. But the most famous and evocative discovery of all came not in Europe, but in northern Iraq, in the same Shanidar cave that gave us evidence of Neanderthal healthcare. There, in the late 1960s, archaeologist Ralph Solecki and his team uncovered the skeleton of an adult male known as Shanidar 4. Around the bones, they found traces of pollen from at least 7 species of flowers: yarrow, cornflower, grape hyacinth, and others. The pollen was concentrated in clusters, suggesting it had been placed with intention rather than blown in by the wind. Solecki proposed that Neanderthals had laid their companion to rest with flowers, creating the first known funeral bouquet in prehistory. The press at the time called it the flower burial, and it instantly transformed how the world saw our extinct cousins. Here, finally, was an image that felt familiar. The act of laying someone to rest, accompanied by beauty. It was as if a hand had reached across the Ice Age, reminding us that mourning did not begin with our species. It began with feeling. The idea captured imaginations far beyond archaeology. Poets wrote of it. Teachers recited it in classrooms. For once, the Neanderthal was not a snarling brute, but a quiet mourner among wildflowers. Later studies would complicate the story. In the 2010s, microbotanical specialists revisited the Shanidar pollen and found that burrowing rodents, who use flowers as nesting material, might have been responsible for depositing some of it. The romantic image of a flower-covered grave may not hold up to strict scrutiny. Yet even as that theory faltered, the core truth did not. The body had been deliberately placed in a pit dug by human hands and protected from disturbance. Intentional burial remains the simplest, strongest explanation. And so the question lingers: why? Why would a species living in such harsh conditions, battling cold, hunger and danger, spend precious energy to bury its dead? To cover a corpse is to take time from survival. The act implies something more than instinct. It implies emotion. Perhaps they did it to keep scavengers away. Perhaps they feared the smell of decay near their shelters. Or perhaps, and here science must allow humility, they did it because they felt loss. Modern researchers use cautious language: mortuary behaviour, disposal of the dead, intentional placement. But behind those clinical phrases lies something deeply human. Every act of burial contains a spark of memory. To cover the dead is to acknowledge the boundary between presence and absence, to give form to grief. Whether Neanderthals believed in an afterlife we cannot know, but by shaping the earth around their dead, they shaped meaning into death itself. Imagine the scene again, this time not in France or Iraq, but in a cold valley in southern Europe 50,000 years ago. A small band has lost one of its own, a hunter perhaps, or a mother. The group gathers by torchlight. Some stand apart, silent. Others kneel beside the body. Hands press soil over fur, smoothing it flat. Maybe they sing softly, or maybe they simply breathe together. One picks up a red stone, grinds it between 2 fingers, and scatters the dust across the body. It is not pigment for art this time, it is pigment for farewell. When they leave, the firelight dims, and the cave keeps their secret. These gestures, flowers, ochre, arranged stones, are small, but they change everything about how we see Neanderthals. They show foresight, respect, and emotional connection. They suggest that memory, that peculiar human ache for what is gone, existed long before us. Some anthropologists argue that these acts of burial are the first material expressions of symbolic thought, the moment when life and death began to mean something beyond themselves. Skeptics point out that even if Neanderthals buried their dead, it doesn't necessarily mean they practiced ritual or had religion. It could have been practical, to avoid disease or predators. But the consistency, the repetition, the care in positioning and protection, these behaviours speak of something else. Repetition creates tradition, and tradition creates meaning. When a behaviour is performed again and again, it becomes more than instinct. It becomes culture. What moves us most about these discoveries is not what we can prove, but what we can feel through the evidence. The imprint of fingers pressing earth, the faint traces of pollen, the folded limbs of a body at rest. These are echoes of emotion fossilized in stone. They remind us that grief is ancient. The ache of losing someone is not a modern invention. It is an inheritance. The act of burial may also have served another purpose: connection. To bury is to mark a place. Each grave became a point in the landscape, a reminder of where someone once lived and mattered. In that sense, Neanderthal burials were not just about the dead. They were about the living, about memory anchored in earth. When a group returned to the same cave or valley season after season, they would know, this is where our people lie. This is where we remember. One can almost imagine the first moment of realization that death was permanent, that someone would not return. It is a moment that must have struck like cold air in the chest. Perhaps it began with silence, a companion who no longer stirred, no longer breathed, a strange stillness. The living gathered, waiting for movement that never came. From that silence, something new was born, the concept of goodbye. In Shanidar cave today, archaeologists continue to uncover new burials. In recent years, they found yet another body, an adult, deliberately placed in the same sediment layer as earlier Neanderthals. The soil analysis shows the pit was dug intentionally, the body covered carefully. Thousands of years separated these burials, yet they occurred in the same corner of the cave. It is as if the memory of burial itself persisted, an inherited act of remembrance passed from one generation to the next. So when we look into that dark chamber, when we see the curve of a skull or the outline of folded limbs, we're not merely observing a fossil, we're witnessing empathy made tangible, a moment when ancient hands tried to soften the hardest part of existence. They could not stop death, but they could shape it. They could give it form, and that may be the oldest form of art there is. Perhaps then, the first human monument was not a temple or a statue, but a grave, a shallow hollow in the earth, filled not only with bones but with memory. Long before words or prayers, long before carved idols or painted caves, a handful of Neanderthals gathered in the dark and decided that the dead should not be left alone. They covered them with soil, maybe flowers, maybe red dust, small gestures that still speak louder than any theory. And as we peer across that gulf of time, we might recognize ourselves in them. The quiet we keep at funerals, the way we still bring flowers to graves. Their acts were the first draft of ours. In that sense, we did not invent mourning. We inherited it. What if I told you that somewhere on the Ice Age steppe, under a sky heavy with snow and smoke, two different kinds of humans once stood face to face, studying one another in the glow of opposing fires. One, shorter, stockier, with deep-set eyes and hands shaped by generations of stone and survival. The other, leaner, lighter, carrying new tools and an unfamiliar language of gesture. Between them stretched silence, wind, and the shared smell of burning wood. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals had been the masters of these lands, and then, around 50,000 years ago, strangers walked in. When modern Homo sapiens first reached Europe and Western Asia, the world was already spoken for. Neanderthals had built homes in the valleys, hunted the rivers, left footprints on the coasts. Their fires had glowed in the dark for over 300,000 years before the first anatomically modern humans appeared. the meeting of these two species wasn't a sudden clash, nor a single moment in one place. It was a slow convergence across mountains, plains, and time. Yet every encounter, whether fleeting or lasting, carried the weight of something unprecedented. The world meeting itself in two mirrors. Archaeologists have found traces of this overlapping world in the caves of the Levant, in Israel's Skul and Kafza caves, where layers of habitation alternate like chapters: Neanderthal, then Homo sapiens, then Neanderthal again. It's as if these groups shared the same addresses, separated by centuries or mere generations. They might never have met directly in those sites, but their fires burned in the same hearths. Their tools lay side by side in the soil, and their children may have played among the same bones of gazelle and deer. In that narrow corridor between Africa and Eurasia, the two human lines brushed shoulders long before Europe ever saw them together. By 50,000 years ago, however, the frontier had moved north and west. Homo sapiens, descendants of those earlier wanderers, began to appear across Europe. At Bachokiro Cave in Bulgaria, bones dated to roughly 46,000 years ago mark some of the earliest modern humans in the region. Their arrival coincided almost exactly with the last flourishing of Neanderthal life. They entered a landscape already rich in skill and culture: the Mousterian toolkits, the hearths, the shelters, the quiet social order of Neanderthals. What followed was not immediate conquest, but coexistence. A delicate, shifting balance. One can imagine the first direct meeting. Perhaps it happened at a watering hole where herds of reindeer or aurochs came to drink. A Neanderthal hunting group approaches from the west, spears ready, their bodies wrapped in hides. From the east another group emerges, taller, thinner, carrying tools of strange shapes, blades struck from long narrow cores, finer and lighter than anything the Neanderthals have seen. The two groups freeze at a distance, watching the same herd, aware suddenly of each other. No one moves. A flick of wind carries the smell of smoke and sweat. One raises a hand, palm open, a gesture of caution or greeting. Another responds in kind. For a heartbeat there is no past and no future, just two kinds of human beings recognizing in the other's face something hauntingly familiar. The archaeological record is silent about such moments, but the evidence whispers around them. In Western Europe, particularly in France and northern Spain, a strange hybrid culture appears at this time, the Châtelperronian. Its tools blend the old Mousterian style with new elements, elegant bladelets, bone ornaments, and personal adornments like pendants and teeth drilled for stringing. Were these innovations created by Neanderthals themselves, or learned from their Homo sapiens neighbours? The debate continues, but either way it marks a cultural conversation written in stone. The Eleusinian culture of Italy shows a similar pattern, tools and ornaments that seem to bridge the gap between the two species. For decades, scientists believe Neanderthals lack the creativity or adaptability to learn from outsiders. Yet these archaeological layers suggest the opposite. They observed, they copied, they improved. Knowledge may have passed between the fires, tool-making techniques, pigment use, perhaps even language fragments. Imitation is one of the oldest forms of understanding, and the fact that Neanderthal craftsmanship evolved at this moment hints that curiosity survived even in times of uncertainty. The newcomers, for their part, must have seen the Neanderthals as both rival and kin. They were not monsters or myths, they were clearly human. The differences, though real, would have been subtle up close: a broader face, shorter limbs, a different rhythm of movement. To a modern eye, Neanderthals would not have looked alien. In heavy clothing, by firelight they could have blended in. The true contrast lay in behaviour and scale. Homo sapiens likely travelled in larger networks, carrying ideas across hundreds of kilometres, linking groups through symbolic culture, beads, carvings, shared styles. Neanderthals, in contrast, lived in smaller, tighter bands bound by family. Their world was intimate, their knowledge local. But local didn't mean simple. Neanderthals had mastered the environments of Ice Age Europe, from the steppe of Ukraine to the oak forests of France. They knew where herds migrated, how to track seasons, how to survive bitter winters. If anything, the advantage of Homo sapiens may not have been strength or intelligence, but connectivity, a wider web of communication and exchange. The encounter between them was not the meeting of primitive and advanced, but of two successful ways of being human. We can only guess how they felt about one another. Did they see kinship or competition? Did curiosity outweigh fear? Anthropologists speculate that the first reactions were probably mixed. Tension at hunting grounds, wary observation, perhaps even avoidance. But the human instinct for recognition is strong. At night, when both groups tended their fires, the sight of other fires on the horizon must have stirred conflicting emotions. Threat, yes, but also fascination. Across the dark plain, voices carried. Laughter, maybe song, drifting faintly through the cold. It is tempting to imagine the first exchange, a cautious approach, gifts of meat or stone, mimed gestures for peace. Two individuals from different worlds, neither fully understanding the other's speech but sensing its cadence. Perhaps they traded tools, perhaps they traded glances. What began as curiosity might have become cooperation, or something even closer. But that, as we will see later, leads into another story. For now, we remain in this fragile equilibrium. A few thousand years of coexistence, one of the briefest yet most extraordinary moments in the human timeline. Archaeological sites across Eurasia record both species within overlapping periods, their artifacts interwoven like threads. At Reparo Bombrini in Italy, stratified layers show Neanderthal occupation giving way almost seamlessly to Homo sapiens. The handover seems gentle, no signs of sudden violence or invasion, just the slow merging and fading of one lineage into another. In some places Neanderthals persisted, in others they vanished. The landscape itself became a tapestry of encounters, alternating fires, alternating footsteps. To step back and view this era is to witness a biological and cultural dialogue unlike any other. For the first time on Earth, two intelligent species, not predator and prey, but equals, shared the same world. The significance of that cannot be overstated. Every other animal either competes or avoids. But humans, even separated by ancestry, are drawn to understanding. The fact that they met at all, and perhaps exchanged ideas and technologies, means empathy and curiosity reached across species boundaries before recorded history even began. Of course, it was not all peace and admiration. Resources were finite and winters long. Both species hunted the same game: reindeer, bison, horse. Both sought the same shelters. Tensions must have flared. Some encounters surely ended in conflict, yet others, just as surely, ended in something else. Shared fires, shared warmth, perhaps shared bloodlines. The archaeological record bears no clear battlefields between them, no evidence of genocide or extermination. If there was competition, it was quiet and gradual, more ecological than violent, a replacement written not in war but in time. There's a haunting thought in that. When modern humans entered Europe, they stepped into a world already human, a mirror of themselves, shaped by different histories. Every Neanderthal they met was a survivor of a lineage stretching back 300,000 years. Every campfire they saw in the distance was a reminder that they were not alone. And perhaps in some deep ancestral way, That realization left an imprint in us. The knowledge that we were once not the only kind of human may explain the strange mixture of pride and melancholy that accompanies the study of Neanderthals. They are gone, but not gone from us. But in this moment, between 50 and 45,000 years ago, the story still breathes. Two kinds of human look out across the same horizon, watch the same auroras flicker in the sky, and feel the same cold on their skin. Both think, both dream, both are alive at once. Maybe the first meeting was awkward, as such things always are. Maybe they stared, unsure whether to run or smile. Maybe they laughed nervously at each other's unfamiliar sounds. Or maybe, and this thought lingers longer than the others, maybe they simply recognized something they had not seen before but somehow always knew. Another consciousness looking back. What if I told you that somewhere in the frozen darkness of Siberia, deep inside a cave layered with thousands of years of human history, a single bone fragment rewrote everything we thought we knew about the boundaries between us? It was no bigger than a child's thumb, pale, splintered, anonymous. When geneticists sequenced its DNA, the result was astonishing. It had belonged to a teenage girl who lived about 90,000 years ago, and her parents were not of the same species. Her mother was a Neanderthal. Her father was a Denisovan, another archaic human lineage that once thrived in Asia. Two vanished worlds meeting in one child. That fragment, found in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains, was nicknamed Denny. She was the first direct hybrid ever discovered in the human fossil record, proof that the great human branches of prehistory didn't just coexist, they intertwined. Her DNA was half Neanderthal, half Denisovan, and her genome showed that her parents themselves came from different populations of each species. This was no rare accident. It was part of a pattern, a quiet continuity of contact, love, and life across evolutionary boundaries. For a long time, scientists imagined the ancient world as a series of clean successions, one species replacing another, each stage tidily separated. Neanderthals, then us. But DNA has no respect for those neat diagrams. In the last 2 decades, the rise of ancient genomics has revealed that prehistory was not a sequence of replacements. It was a web of connections. We were never alone. The turning point came in 2010 when researchers from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published the draft Neanderthal genome. Extracted from bones found in Vindija Cave in Croatia and elsewhere, that ancient DNA showed something no one expected. People living today, especially outside Africa, carry fragments of Neanderthal DNA within their own cells. Between 1 and 2% of the genome of all non-African humans comes from Neanderthal ancestors. The implication was profound. It meant that Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis had met, lived together, and had children, not just once but repeatedly, across tens of thousands of years. The meeting probably happened soon after modern humans left Africa, around 60,000 years ago, somewhere in the Middle East. Genetic clocks, molecular estimates of when DNA lineages diverged, suggest that these encounters occurred in multiple waves. Early sapiens arriving through the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula would have met Neanderthal populations moving south during warm phases of the Ice Age. Later, as humans expanded into Europe and Western Asia, other contacts followed. Each meeting left its trace in our genomes, small, invisible signatures of ancient intimacy that persist in living people today. To a geneticist, those traces are like faint echoes of conversation across millennia. Some regions of our DNA show clear Neanderthal ancestry, especially genes related to skin, hair, and immunity. These weren't random insertions. Many were useful. Neanderthals had lived for hundreds of thousands of years in colder, darker climates, exposed to Eurasian pathogens and seasonal cycles that our African ancestors had never encountered. Their genes carried adaptations for surviving those environments: thicker keratin in hair and skin, changes in fat metabolism, and immune responses tuned to local diseases. When our ancestors interbred with them, they inherited those advantages. In a sense, Neanderthals helped us survive the continents they had already mastered. But not every inheritance was beneficial. Some Neanderthal DNA is associated with increased risk of allergies, autoimmune disorders, and even severe responses to certain viruses, including the modern coronavirus. Evolution doesn't deal in sentiment, it simply passes on what works until it doesn't. Our mixed heritage is a reminder that adaptation is messy, a compromise between survival and cost. Even more fascinating is how widespread that inheritance is. Today, if you are of European or Asian descent, between 1 and 2% of your DNA likely comes from Neanderthals. People from Melanesia and parts of East Asia may carry additional DNA from Denisovans, another lineage that also interbred with Neanderthals and modern humans. Those percentages might sound small, but in total, about 40% of the Neanderthal genome still exists, scattered in fragments across the living human population. No individual carries it all, but together we do. In other words, Neanderthals are not extinct in a genetic sense. They live on, distributed among billions of modern descendants. It is humbling to realise that many of the traits we think of as purely ours are in part gifts from them. Genes influencing circadian rhythms, wound healing, pain sensitivity, and even altitude tolerance have Neanderthal or Denisovan origins. In Tibetans, for instance, a Denisovan gene variant helps regulate oxygen in the blood at high altitudes. Without it, life above 4,000 meters might have been far more difficult. In our bloodstreams, their ancient ingenuity endures. The discovery of Denny, the half-Neanderthal, half-Denisovan girl, gave scientists a window into just how fluid those boundaries were. Her genome revealed not only her mixed parentage, but also signs that her Neanderthal mother carried bits of earlier Homo sapiens DNA from even older interbreeding events 100,000 years before. It's a genetic palimpsest, layers upon layers of contact. Humanity wasn't a tree with separate branches. It was a braided river, flowing together and apart across time. That idea of species as interwoven rather than isolated challenges our very definition of what it means to be human. In biology, a species is often defined by reproductive isolation, the inability to produce fertile offspring. But Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans clearly could. Their unions produced viable, fertile children who carried forward mixed genes. If that's true, then the boundaries between them and us were more porous than we like to think. The idea of a clean division collapses under the weight of DNA evidence. What existed instead was variation, a continuum of humans shaped by geography, climate, and time. We can't know what those relationships were like. Were they peaceful, coercive, romantic? The evidence is mute on that front. Some encounters may have been brief, others long-lasting. Perhaps in some valleys small blended families formed, children who looked like both parents, carrying the features of two worlds. Perhaps those children were accepted, or perhaps they became bridges between groups. We can only guess. But the fact that it happened at all tells us that despite all differences, recognition occurred. Something deeply human passed between them. Attraction, trust, or simply shared survival. It's strange to think that our bodies carry such intimate history. Every time we glance at our hands, our skin tone, the way we metabolize food or respond to cold, we are looking at the outcome of ancient unions. What once were species boundaries have become our inheritance. And in a small twist of irony, the modern technologies that revealed this, the sequencing machines humming in sterile labs, are themselves built by descendants of those same hybrid ancestors. The Neanderthal genome did more than change prehistory, it redefined ancestry. For the first time, scientists could map the story of love, migration and survival into molecules. It connected personal identity to deep time. It showed that our family tree isn't a ladder of progress, but a mosaic of shared bloodlines. Humanity is, and always has been, a collective. Some geneticists now speak of a ghost population of ancient humans, unknown yet traceable through DNA patterns, groups that mixed with us but left no fossils. The world of 50,000 years ago was far more crowded with humans than we ever imagined. We were one species among several, and rather than wipe them out immediately, we absorbed them. Every hybrid, every shared child was a tiny act of continuity. Like humour helps the gravity of it settle, what happens in prehistory, it turns out, doesn't stay in prehistory. If you have pale skin that burns easily, or if your immune system overreacts to pollen, or if your sleep schedule is a little too sensitive to daylight, thank your Neanderthal great-great-great-grandparents. They didn't disappear, they merely moved in, permanently, a few genes at a time. Still, these discoveries raise as many questions as they answer. Why did the Neanderthal and Denisovan lineages fade while ours expanded? If we were close enough to merge, what tipped the balance toward one branch surviving? That mystery lingers like the echo of their footsteps in our chromosomes. But for now, it's enough to acknowledge the truth that science has quietly confirmed. We are not pure. We are the descendants of mixtures, inheritors of shared blood, living mosaics of ancient love stories written in DNA. So the next time someone says we are the last humans, remember, we never truly were. The others walk with us still, written into every cell, whispering through the ages that being human was never about separation. It was about connection all along. Imagine the wind moving through an empty cave carrying only the smell of salt and cold. Ashes scatter from an ancient hearth long gone cold, bones of shellfish lie brittle beside it, and the faint impression of a heel in damp sand fades as the tide creeps in. This was once home to a family of Neanderthals, perhaps the last on Earth. Around 40,000 years ago, their firelight dimmed for the final time. No single cataclysm erased them. Instead, they ebbed away like snowmelt, fading from the record of living memory, leaving behind traces too quiet for their contemporaries to notice. The Ice Age world they inhabited was shifting once again. Temperatures plunged in violent fits, glaciers advanced and retreated with bewildering speed, and the landscapes that had sustained them for hundreds of thousands of years began to betray them. Forests withered into open tundra. Rivers froze more often than they flowed. Herds of reindeer and bison changed their migration routes, and plants their growth seasons. The Neanderthals had endured climate shifts before, but this one was different, faster, harsher, and arriving just as new competitors appeared across the horizon. In Europe, Homo sapiens were spreading north and west, following the game and the open steppe. They were fewer at first, but their networks stretched across great distances. Tools, pigments, and food moved from group to group through wide webs of exchange. When the cold struck and resources thinned, these networks meant survival. For Neanderthals living in smaller, more isolated groups, the same blow could be fatal. Archaeological layers from this period, roughly 40 to 37,000 years ago, tell a story of fragmentation. In Central Europe, Neanderthal sites vanish abruptly, replaced by those of modern humans. In the Iberian Peninsula, traces linger slightly longer, suggesting that a few groups held out in refuges like Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar. a sea-facing limestone shelter where hearths and stone flakes tell of last attempts to persist. Yet even these coastal havens were temporary. The cold tightened its grip. The seas themselves fell as ice sheets expanded, stranding old shorelines far from the new water's edge. Imagine a small group there, a few adults, perhaps a child or two, gathering shellfish by the pale light of a glacial dawn, their footprints mingling with gull tracks in the sand. They used bones and driftwood for fires, scavenged seal fat for light. For them, the world was not ending in a blaze, but quietly contracting. Genetic evidence from late Neanderthal remains tells a similar story of contraction. The genomes of the last known individuals, such as those from Vindia Cave in Croatia, reveal signs of extreme inbreeding. These were small, dwindling populations, often isolated from one another by mountains and climate barriers. When numbers fall below a few thousand, chance itself becomes an enemy. A bad winter, a poor hunt, or a single outbreak of disease can erase entire bands. And when those bands stop meeting, stop exchanging mates, their diversity dwindles. The Neanderthal genome shows the marks of this loneliness. Some carried long stretches of identical DNA inherited from recent relatives, a sign that cousins had become parents, not by choice, but by circumstance. Into this fragile ecology stepped our species, one that looked similar but lived by slightly different rules. Modern humans organised in broader alliances, exchanged goods across long distances, and possibly used symbolic communication to coordinate group behaviour on scales Neanderthals may never have needed before. That difference, multiplied across generations, might have tilted the balance. It is not that Homo sapiens were stronger or smarter in any absolute sense, but perhaps they were more numerous, more flexible, or simply luckier when the environment turned cruel. Competition for food surely followed. The archaeological record hints at overlapping territories, at times even overlapping technologies. In parts of France and Spain, tool assemblages like the Châtel Perronien blur the line between Neanderthal and sapiens craftsmanship. Did Neanderthals copy the newcomers, or did both exchange ideas before the end? We can't say for certain, but by the time modern humans spread across Europe's forests and plains, Neanderthal camps were becoming rarer, their hearths fewer. Climate models suggest that between 42 and 39,000 years ago, Europe was struck by abrupt cold events known as Heinrich stadials, sudden collapses of climate stability, when vast armadas of icebergs flooded the North Atlantic, shutting down ocean currents and plunging temperatures across the continent. These would have decimated forests, scattered prey, and erased the delicate balance on which small Neanderthal communities depended. Disease may have followed. When populations that have been separated for long periods meet, pathogens travel with them. It's possible that Homo sapiens carried viruses or bacteria from Africa or the Near East that Neanderthals had never encountered. Even a mild illness could have spread swiftly through tightly knit groups, leaving them weakened at critical times. Yet despite the hardships, the final Neanderthals did not simply vanish without resilience. Excavations in Gibraltar show late occupations where they adapted to marine resources, catching fish, harvesting mussels, and using seaweed and shells as tools. In one hearth, researchers found burned mussel shells mixed with charcoal, suggesting they used what remained around them to fuel their fires. These were creative survivors, adjusting even in the shadow of extinction. Imagine that last small group by the sea, wrapped in animal hides, staring at the horizon. The land behind them was freezing over. The mountains were impassable. The forests they once knew were gone, and the herds that once sustained them had moved north or perished. All that remained was the sound of surf and the scent of salt on the air. Perhaps they still told stories, simple ones, passed from elder to child. Perhaps they remembered how to hunt mammoth, even if mammoths no longer roam their coast. The fire crackles, the youngest drifts to sleep. By dawn, the wind carries their warmth away. In the grand scale of prehistory, the disappearance was not even abrupt. By 37,000 years ago, the distinct Neanderthal morphology disappears from the fossil record. The bones we find after that, whether in caves, open sites or burials, belong to Homo sapiens. There was no war, no conquest recorded in stone, just silence filling the spaces where they had once lived. For a long time, no one would notice. The Ice Age would roll on, carving valleys and reshaping rivers, burying their camps beneath layers of sediment. Tens of thousands of years later, we would stumble upon their traces, a skull in a quarry, a tool in the dust, and ask who they were. But in their own time, there was no witness to their passing. No one left to say goodbye. If you walk the beaches of Gibraltar today, you can still look into Gorham's cave as the afternoon light fades. The tide rises where Neanderthals once knelt to gather shellfish. The same salt smell hangs in the air. Their footprints have long since eroded, but the sense of presence lingers, as if the wind itself remembers the voices that once echoed there. In the end, their disappearance may not have a single cause. Climate, competition, disease, isolation, all likely intertwined. It was not a fall, but a fade, a slow retreat of a people who had weathered 200,000 years of storms, only to lose to the smallest adversary of all, time. And yet their story does not close here. A few fragments of their essence endured, in DNA, in the shape of our bones, in the flicker of empathy that we now recognize as deeply human. The Neanderthals did not leave in failure, they simply became part of us. What if I told you that right now, as you breathe, your body carries the memory of another kind of human, a species that vanished 40,000 years ago? Somewhere deep in your cells, in the code that builds your skin, your lungs, your brain, are small fragments that once pulsed inside a Neanderthal. You are, in a quiet and literal sense, part of them. When scientists completed the Neanderthal Genome Project in the early years of the 21st century, they expected to learn about an extinct cousin. Instead, they discovered family. DNA from bones found in the Vindija cave of Croatia and the Altai mountains of Siberia revealed an astonishing truth. Modern humans outside Africa still carry between 1 and 2% of Neanderthal DNA. It means that when Homo sapiens spread from Africa into Eurasia, they did not merely replace the people they met, they intertwined with them. The echoes of those unions still whisper through our biology. Imagine a strand of DNA like a sentence written millions of years ago, copied again and again with small edits. Somewhere in your genome, a few of those words, sometimes even whole paragraphs, were written by Neanderthals. Some of these fragments are quiet passengers, neutral and harmless. Others still speak. They help shape how your skin senses sunlight, how your body handles cold, even how your immune system fights disease. For instance, researchers found that certain immune-related genes called toll-like receptors, inherited from Neanderthals, help modern humans detect and respond to pathogens, a legacy of Ice Age survival in harsh, infectious environments. Yet not all gifts are blessings. A genetic region on chromosome 3, also derived from Neanderthals, has been linked to increased risk of severe respiratory distress during COVID-19 infection. It seems that an ancient adaptation, once beneficial against prehistoric viruses, can turn against us in a modern pandemic. Evolution never makes promises, it simply preserves what worked once. even if the world has changed. The Neanderthal influence extends beyond immunity. Some variants affect our circadian rhythm, the body's internal clock. Studies suggest that people with more Neanderthal DNA in these regions tend to have different sleep cycles, possibly favouring late-night activity. Perhaps under the long dusks of Ice Age Europe, staying awake longer meant survival, guarding the fire, watching the dark. It's a strange thought. Your modern insomnia might be the echo of a Neanderthal's night watch. Other genes trace to hair and skin. When early Homo sapiens entered Eurasia, they encountered new light conditions and climates. Neanderthal variants in pigmentation genes may have helped them adjust, lightening skin and hair to improve vitamin D production under weaker sunlight. Those same variants are still with us today, scattered across populations from Europe to Asia. Even aspects of metabolism carry traces of them. Some Neanderthal alleles influence how we store fat and process carbohydrates, perhaps once vital for surviving long winters when food was scarce. In a modern context, those same genes can predispose people to weight gain or insulin resistance. Ancient endurance, repurposed by modern abundance. It's humbling, and a little ironic, that so much of what defines our health today began as Ice Age survival strategy. When geneticists compare genomes from living people with those of ancient Neanderthals, they can even identify the ghosts of specific encounters. A stretch of Neanderthal DNA may appear in an East Asian population, but not in Europeans, or vice versa, showing that interbreeding happened multiple times in different regions. Each meeting left a slightly different genetic fingerprint, as if every exchange between species wrote a separate verse in the long song of humanity. In some ways, Neanderthals never really vanished. They diffused. Their bodies gone, but their code folded into ours. Direct-to-consumer DNA tests sometimes tell people what percentage of Neanderthal DNA they carry. Most users take it as trivia, a fun footnote on an ancestry report. But behind that small number lies a profound truth. Your blood, your skin, and even your thoughts are shaped by beings who once napped flint under Ice Age moons. There's something grounding about that knowledge. Every breath you take with lungs that trace their immune sensors to a Neanderthal mutation. Every morning your body responds to sunlight through pathways first refined in Ice Age valleys. It's all continuity. We're not simply their descendants in spirit, but in sequence. One could even say that when we study Neanderthals, we are studying ourselves, minus 40,000 years of change. Some researchers suspect that the Neanderthal contribution may even influence neurological traits. Certain genetic variants they passed on have been associated with mood regulation and susceptibility to depression or nicotine addiction. The science is still cautious, correlations not certainties, but it paints an intimate picture. Perhaps their inner worlds were rich and restless too. Perhaps the same neural circuits that gave them empathy and imagination still pulse faintly in our dreams. A few Neanderthal sequences are found in genes that shape cranial development and synaptic connectivity. It does not mean they made us smarter, but rather that evolution borrowed from both lineages to refine what we now call the human mind. We are a mosaic species, part African, part Eurasian, part Neanderthal, part Denisovan, each thread woven through time. This blending reminds us that nature does not draw hard boundaries. It shades species into one another like brushstrokes across a vast canvas. The more we decode, the blurrier the lines become. To the Neanderthal, difference was likely measured not in genes but in presence, in scent, sound, or movement. They could not know that fragments of their genome would persist in distant descendants who would one day carry smartphones and sequence DNA. They might have recognized something in our faces, though. The curve of a brow, the warmth of a gesture, the quiet intelligence behind a gaze. Even now, that recognition lingers in reverse. When we look at their reconstructed faces, we see ourselves. It's worth noting that some populations, particularly those with African ancestry, have little or no Neanderthal DNA, not because of a lack of kinship, but because the mixing occurred after Homo sapiens had already begun spreading into Eurasia. But modern Africans still carry echoes of other ancient lineages, perhaps from now extinct populations within Africa itself. Humanity has always been plural. Our family tree is not a trunk but a braided river. The Neanderthals are one of its most visible tributaries, their current still running through the veins of billions. So what does this mean for us? On one level, it's a scientific marvel, proof that DNA can outlive extinction, whispering from the past into the present. On another, it's a quiet reconciliation. The other we once imagined as alien turns out to be within us. We inherit not only their genes, but their endurance, their curiosity, their long experiment with life on this unpredictable planet. We are not the end of their story. We are its continuation. So the next time you look at your hands in the light, or stay awake too late, or sneeze at spring pollen, remember that you're not entirely modern. You're also a fragment of something ancient, something that endured the ice, hunted mammoths, and watched the stars long before names existed for any of it. We carry them forward every day without even realizing it. Imagine standing in a limestone quarry on a grey summer day in the year 1856, the air thick with dust and echoes of hammer strikes. A workman pulls from the rock not coal or mineral, but a skull cap, thick, heavy, strangely shaped. The valley is called Neanderthal, near Dusseldorf in Germany. No one knows it yet, but humanity's self-image has just cracked open. The bones, later studied by Johann Karl Fuhlrott and anatomist Hermann Schaafhausen, did not fit neatly into the known catalogue of creation. They were ancient, powerful, and foreign. The skull's low forehead and massive brow ridges seemed to belong to another kind of human, or perhaps to a creature not fully human at all. The idea that our species might not be alone in its lineage was both thrilling and terrifying. Early scientists did not yet have the tools of radiocarbon dating or genetics, so they leaned on imagination, and imagination in the Victorian age was steeped in hierarchy. To many, the thought of other humans felt like an affront to the tidy order of progress. When Marcelin Boule, a respected French paleontologist, reconstructed a nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton from La Chapelle-aux-Saints in the early 1900s, his analysis seemed to confirm what polite society wanted to believe. The skeleton, bent by arthritis, was depicted as a stooped, brutish caveman with knees bent, head thrust forward, and a primitive scowl. Boule's writings describe Neanderthals as stupid, ape-like, and without language, a biological failure on the evolutionary road to us. What he did not realise was that his specimen was old, diseased, and unrepresentative. But his vision, that of the hunchbacked, club-wielding brute, caught fire in the popular imagination. For decades, the word Neanderthal became an insult, shorthand for ignorance, aggression, or backwardness. Schoolbooks and newspapers carried cartoons of shaggy cavemen dragging women by the hair. Even serious scientists spoke of them as evolutionary dead ends, creatures extinguished because they lacked the spark of reason. We saw them as everything we were not, the mirror image of civilization's vanity. Then, quietly, the evidence began to rebel against the stereotype. In the mid-20th century, archaeology grew up. Excavations became slower, more careful, less about collecting trophies and more about context. In the late 1950s, deep in Shanidar cave in Iraq, archaeologists unearthed several Neanderthal skeletons. One of them, known as Shanidar 1, had survived crushing injuries and lived for decades with a withered arm and partial blindness. Another, Shanidar 4, lay surrounded by pollen from wildflowers. Ralph Solecki, the American archaeologist leading the dig, proposed that this was a deliberate burial, perhaps even a funerary ritual. The notion was radical. Could the brutes have cared for their wounded and honoured their dead? Some resisted, others scoffed, but a new idea began to take root. Maybe the Neanderthals were not our inferior ancestors, but our emotional equals. The picture kept changing. As new sites emerged across Europe, La Ferracie in France, Kepaha in Israel, Spy in Belgium, each brought more evidence of intelligence, adaptability and artfulness. Archaeologists found stone tools of startling sophistication, evidence of controlled fire, pigments, and even personal ornaments. The old caricature of the hairy, drooling caveman began to crumble, yet cultural inertia is powerful. Well into the 1970s, textbooks still showed Boole's stooped figure. Scientists were divided, some clinging to the notion that Neanderthals lacked symbolic thought, others daring to suggest they might have had language, compassion, even beauty. As one anthropologist quipped, the hardest fossil to change is the one in our own heads. Then came the revolution no one expected, the age of ancient DNA. In the closing years of the 20th century, biochemistry met prehistory. From a single Neanderthal bone found in a Croatian cave, scientists managed to extract fragments of genetic material. It was degraded, but enough to glimpse a pattern. Over the following decade, as technology improved, more sequences were recovered. Finally, in the year 2010, an international team announced the first draft of the Neanderthal genome. The results overturned centuries of assumption. Modern humans outside Africa shared around 2% of their DNA with Neanderthals. We had not replaced them, we had mingled. They were not a separate chapter of evolution, but one of our pages. The brute had become a brother. Museums began to change their displays. The Neanderthal was no longer shown as hunched and dim-witted, but upright, broad-chested, with expressive eyes and faces that could belong to neighbours, friends, even lovers. Artists like Elizabeth Danis and Kennis began sculpting lifelike reconstructions that confronted visitors with an unsettling familiarity. Standing before these faces, you didn't see a missing link, but someone you might nod to on a train. Even language softened. The term archaic human replaced primitive. Anthropologists spoke not of superiority but of diversity. Multiple human forms coexisting, sharing skills and genes. New findings continued to erode the old myth of isolation. The discovery of the Denisovans, another branch of humanity, revealed through DNA from a Siberian cave, showed that the Pleistocene world was not a ladder, but a tangled web of kin. Neanderthals were part of that web, contributing not just artifacts but living code. They were not failures. They were ancestors who happened to leave no direct line of their own, except through us. Even pop culture began to repent. Novels, documentaries and films reimagined them as complex beings, sometimes tragic, sometimes noble. The caveman cliché gave way to curiosity and empathy. In classrooms, teachers now describe Neanderthals as Ice Age Europeans who thrived for hundreds of millennia. Inventors, hunters, and caretakers, extinguished not by stupidity but by circumstance. Science had not just restored their dignity, it had humbled us. For generations we defined intelligence by looking down on them. Yet every excavation, every genome sequence, and every fossil analysis forced us to look sideways instead. They were not almost human, they were human. The boundary had always been an illusion built on ignorance. Perhaps that is the quiet triumph of their story. They taught us to redefine what it means to belong to our own species. The tools that once measured difference, bone angles, brain size, brow ridges, now measure connection. Even proteins extracted from ancient Neanderthal remains tell us about their physiology, how their muscles worked, how their cells repaired damage, how their blood carried oxygen. Each molecule closes another distance. The brute fades, the brother stands revealed. In the end, the transformation of the Neanderthal's image mirrors the evolution of science itself, from arrogance to empathy, from speculation to evidence. In the 19th century, we imagine them in our own worst image. In the 21st, we recognize them in our own reflection. They have not changed. We have. It took us 1.5 centuries to learn that the line separating us from them was drawn in the wrong place, not in bone, but in imagination. Perhaps that is the lasting moral of their rediscovery. The measure of humanity is not who we exclude, but who we are willing to understand. What if I told you that everything we once used to define ourselves, fire, family, art, language, love, they had it too? The further science digs into the bones and ashes of Neanderthals, the harder it becomes to see where they ended and we began. Across 500,000 years of existence, they left behind not chaos, but evidence of order, structure, cooperation, invention. When we lay out the pieces of their story, they form not the silhouette of a beast, but the outline of a mind startlingly familiar. Begin with intelligence, the quiet kind, practical and precise. 200,000 years ago, long before Homo sapiens appeared in Europe, Neanderthals were already making birch bark glue. To create it, they heated strips of bark in low oxygen conditions until they produced a sticky resin strong enough to haft stone points to wooden shafts. That single innovation required controlled fire, knowledge of materials and stepwise reasoning, chemistry before there were chemists. Later they began twisting plant fibres into string, weaving multiple strands together in reverse directions to strengthen them. In one sense, it's simple craft work. In another, it's abstract engineering. Each twist had to be mirrored, tension balanced, a small act of cognition, a grasp of logic in the fingers. Intelligence for them was never about novelty for novelty's sake. It was about mastery of necessity, knowing just enough to survive but with quiet elegance. Then there's creativity. When we picture Neanderthals, we often imagine them as pragmatic survivors, but evidence shows they also made things that served no direct purpose. An eagle talon shaped into a pendant, a shell painted red and perforated to hang from a cord, a deer bone carved with a zigzag pattern that no blade required. These are gestures that rise beyond function. They belong to the realm of meaning. To take time to shape beauty or symbolism in a harsh Ice Age world suggests something astonishing, the existence of thought for its own sake. Perhaps a story was attached, or perhaps not. Maybe just the joy of creation, the ancient satisfaction of marking the world as one's own. They understood not just survival, but significance. Their culture, if we dare use that word, was rich not in scale, but in depth. Their groups were small, perhaps no more than a few dozen individuals, yet the bonds that held them together were fierce. We know this from their bones. A broken arm that healed cleanly means someone tended the injured. A toothless elder who lived long past the point of self-sufficiency means someone shared food. A man in Shanidar cave who was half blind, crippled and deaf, lived for decades because others cared for him. These are not isolated acts, and they are a pattern of compassion. Empathy was not invented by us. It is one of the oldest technologies of survival. Around their hearths, Neanderthals likely shared stories, teaching and laughter. Linguistic evidence, from the shape of the hyoid bone and the FOXP2 gene, suggests they could produce a full range of sounds. Their ear bones were tuned to frequencies of speech. The implication is profound. They didn't just grunt, they conversed. Perhaps their language was less abstract than ours, maybe bound more to the immediate world of hunt, kin and fire. But it was language nonetheless, a shared code that linked minds. Try to imagine the voices, low, melodic, echoing softly off cave walls, a mother soothing a child, hunters planning an ambush, friends exchanging a private joke. If you could step into that moment, you would hear something that sounds uncannily like home. They were not only vocal but emotional. To bury the dead, as they sometimes did, is to act on feelings unseen, love, grief, or at least respect for life's ending. Even if not every burial was ceremonial, the choice to cover a body with earth, to protect it from scavengers, to bring flowers or pigment, reveals a sense of care that goes beyond instinct. The Neanderthal heart, it seems, was capable of tenderness. It's tempting to think of them as slower, somehow less innovative. Their tool styles, like the Mousterian, persisted for long stretches with little change, while Homo sapiens' inventions spread and diversified rapidly. But perhaps that difference reflects not mental limitation, but environmental stability. In a world where one method worked for millennia, reinvention wasn't needed. They mastered a rhythm of life adapted to the Ice Age's pulse, hunting reindeer and mammoth, shaping stone with precision, maintaining balance with the land. Their intelligence may have been measured not in progress, but in persistence. Even their art, fragmentary though it is, shows foresight. The stalagmite rings of Bruniquel Cave, built 170,000 years ago, required coordination and vision. To carry torches deep underground and stack hundreds of stone fragments into circles was not idle behaviour. It was architecture, maybe ritual, maybe the birth of imagination. They lived with awareness of space and structure, the first architects of darkness. If we look through the lens of psychology, Neanderthals reveal a mind not alien but parallel. They experienced pain and loss, joy and curiosity. They planned, they adapted, they protected, they taught. The spark of consciousness that we like to call uniquely human was shared. The only major distinction might lie in social scale. Homo sapiens built vast exchange networks across continents, allowing ideas to travel far and mutate quickly. Neanderthals, with smaller, more dispersed populations, likely innovated more slowly. But that is a difference of geography and numbers, not essence. If a Neanderthal child were somehow brought into a modern human home, raised with speech, play, and learning, most scientists suspect they would grow into someone indistinguishable from us in behaviour and emotion. The brain capacity is there, the neural architecture is there, and, most importantly so, the capacity for connection is there. The thought is unsettling and comforting at once. The Ice Age child and the modern child could share the same laughter. Every fossil, every tool, every buried body narrows the gap until the distinction feels more semantic than biological. So, how human were they? If we judge by the checklist, toolmaker, caregiver, artist, communicator, mourner, they pass with ease. The few differences that remain are of tempo, not of tune. We evolved along different paths, but to different ends of the same spectrum. Perhaps what truly separates us is not intellect, but luck, timing, geography, and the sheer accident of survival. In a fair world we might still share the planet with them, yet maybe in a way we do. Their DNA runs in our blood, their stories run in our science. We call them Neanderthals, as if the name belongs to another, but it's really just another branch of human. We inherited their endurance, their fire, their curiosity. Even their quiet persistence echoes in us whenever we sit by a fire and stare into the dark, wondering about the past. For a long time we looked at their bones and saw beasts. Now, after a century and a half of study, we see something far more unsettling: ourselves. What if I told you that being human was never ours alone? That long before the modern world, two kinds of mind sat beneath the same stars, different in form, but not in feeling, and that for a brief, glittering span of time, humanity was plural. Picture the world 60,000 years ago. A night on the steppe. A fire flickers between two small families, one Neanderthal, one Homo sapiens. Children chase each other around the edge of the glow, laughing in two slightly different accents of the same ancient tongue. The adults watch from their circle of warmth, nursing tired limbs after a day's hunt. One hums softly, another sharpens a stone blade. Across the flames their eyes meet, wary perhaps, but curious. The air smells of smoke, earth, and mammoth fat. Above them, the constellations they can't name shimmer in the dark, the same ones we look up at now. That moment, if it ever happened, would not have felt like science fiction. It would have felt ordinary. For the first time in our planet's history, two species shared a single definition of human. For generations we believed that title belonged solely to us, that language, art, empathy, and imagination marked the threshold of our kind. Yet the fossils, the tools, the DNA, and the faint traces of pigment on ancient shells have whispered something different. Those qualities didn't appear twice by chance. They were seeded deep, long before either lineage walked the tundra. The capacity for wonder, for love, for planning and grief. These were not inventions of our species. They were inheritances. They grew in the dark soil of an older world and flowered along parallel branches of the human tree. We did not invent humanity. We inherited it. That realization is strangely humbling. It means that the spark of consciousness, that self-awareness we like to treat as a crown, is not a single flame passed forward, but a constellation that once burned across several skies. For 200,000 years or more, the Earth was shared by minds that thought, felt, and dreamed in their own languages of survival. Each was an experiment in the same ancient question: what can intelligence do with tenderness? To be human, it turns out, was not a single form, but a shared condition, and for a while it was a chorus, not a solo. If we listen carefully to what the evidence shows, it suggests that humanity's essence is older and broader than our own name. The traits we prize, creativity, communication, care, were not exclusive signatures of our species, but common notes in the song of our genus. They evolved not to divide us, but to connect us. Compassion was adaptive long before we could write the word for it. Cooperation was sacred before we could tell stories about gods. When a Neanderthal cared for an injured elder or buried a child beneath a layer of ochre, they were participating in the same instinct that drives us to build hospitals and memorials today: the refusal to let another suffer alone or vanish unnoticed. That instinct is not a modern invention. It's a biological inheritance, older than history. So when we ask what separates us from them, perhaps we're asking the wrong question. The better one might be, what still binds us? The more we learn about our cousins, the more the lines blur. Their hands shape the same physics, their voices echo the same acoustics, their hearts beat in the same rhythm of fear and longing. Even our genetic mingling, that subtle trace of them in our DNA, is a literal testament to kinship. The boundaries of species were porous, the boundaries of humanity even more so. For the first time, we see that the story of our kind was never one of pure succession, not before and after, but together and apart. Humanity was never an invention of one species. It was a shared condition of many. Perhaps that's the quiet lesson Neanderthals leave us. that consciousness is not a finish line but a landscape, one that several kinds of minds have wandered through. We often treat our intelligence as a miracle, a rare accident in the cosmos. But if two branches of one family evolved empathy and artfulness on the same planet, perhaps the emergence of meaning is not as fragile as we fear. Maybe it is written into the physics of life, the inevitable consequence of time and awareness intertwining. Maybe to feel wonder is the universe becoming aware of itself through more than one voice. The more we see Neanderthals as kin, the less lonely we become in that realization. Imagine again that shared firelight, the crackle, the sparks rising into the night. Two kinds of human warmth side by side. If we could sit there now, not as scientists or storytellers, but as silent observers, would we know which was us and which was them? Their laughter, their small talk, their songs. Would we even tell them apart? Perhaps our ancestors did not either. Perhaps they didn't need to. For all the differences written in bone, what mattered most? The gesture of sharing warmth, the instinct to comfort, the curiosity about the stars as was the same. And that sameness, that bridge across biology, is the quiet miracle of our shared past. Recognizing it shifts more than just our view of Neanderthals. It reshapes our understanding of the future. Because if being human is not defined by species, then it might not end with us. The qualities we cherish, empathy, cooperation, creation, could emerge again, elsewhere, under different skies or in forms we can't yet imagine. The Neanderthals remind us that intelligence is not singular. It can wear many faces, inhabit many worlds. The moral of their rediscovery is not nostalgia, but humility. We were not the first to feel love, nor will we be the last to seek meaning. Our story is one strand in a greater pattern, one ripple in an ancient tide. In that sense, they have never truly gone. Their blood flows in ours, their fire burns in our rituals, their tenderness still lingers in the way we hold one another close against the dark. The light of that fire, shared across 60 millennia, still flickers on the walls of our minds. And as we look forward to a future of artificial minds, of possible new intelligences beyond Earth, perhaps we can remember what our cousins once taught us, that difference need not mean distance, and that the measure of a mind lies not in its species, but in its capacity to care. Humanity, it seems, has never belonged to one kind alone. It is a shared inheritance, a story told in many voices across time, each one adding its own verse to the oldest song we know. Imagine standing at the mouth of a cave at dawn. The fire behind you has gone cold, the smoke long since faded. The air is sharp and quiet, heavy with the weight of time. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the last Neanderthals are still alive, not as ghosts, not as myths, but as families. A mother tending embers, a child watching snow drift from the pines, a man sharpening a tool he's used for years, knowing the rhythm of each strike better than he knows his own heartbeat. It is easy to imagine them vanishing into the fog of prehistory, but harder to imagine that they ever truly left us, because the closer we've looked, the more clearly we've seen that they were never something other. They were people. For 2 centuries the bones told a story of difference. The skulls were thicker, the brows heavier, the limbs stronger. They were labelled as the almost human, the nearly there. Yet evidence by evidence, decade by decade, that distance has collapsed. Behind those bones we found not a missing link, but a mirror. They lived in small, warm groups. They crafted tools with precision, used pigments to colour their world, and buried their dead with quiet purpose. They cared for one another through illness, celebrated survival with food and fire, and raised children who played by the sea. They watch the same stars we name today, tracing patterns in the same sky. To walk through their story is to walk through our own reflection, a version of humanity shaped by different winters, different paths, but guided by the same light. When we think of humanity as a solitary triumph, we miss the truth that humbles and expands us. For most of our history, we were not alone. There were others, other hearts beating through the Ice Age, other minds weighing choices in the dark, other hands building fires, weaving fibres, painting on stone. For hundreds of thousands of years, the planet held several kinds of us, all struggling, learning and feeling their way through existence. Theirs was not a failed experiment, but another verse in the same song, a harmony that faded softly, leaving echoes in our blood and memory. To call them human is not generosity, it is accuracy. What made them human is the same thing that makes us so, the capacity for meaning, the ability to look at the world and see not just what is, but what could be, the impulse to create warmth, to protect another, to turn stone and pigment into memory. If they could imagine, they could belong to that word we hold sacred, human, and every artifact they left behind, a flint flake, a handprint, a grave, is a line in that shared story. The old image of the brutish caveman has dissolved, replaced by something both more ordinary and more profound, kinship. The kind of kinship that cannot be measured by genes alone, but by the shared pulse of empathy across time. To recognize that is to soften something inside ourselves, because when we acknowledge Neanderthals as human, we also admit that humanity is not a fragile crown we alone wear. It is a continuum, a conversation. A light passed hand to hand across millennia, and though their branch of that conversation ended, the words they spoke through their actions, care, curiosity, courage, still echo through us. Science has shown us their DNA lives on, but perhaps the deeper truth is that their spirit does too. In every gesture of care, every quiet act of endurance, every moment of reflection by a fire, we continue the same ancient practice of being human together. Their story reminds us that existence is not a contest, but a chorus. Even extinction does not erase a life's meaning, it transforms it into memory. The Neanderthals' memory lives not in their fossils, but in the questions they leave us with. Questions about what it means to belong, to feel, to love, and to lose. Perhaps somewhere deep down we've been searching for them not just in the sediments of Europe or the DNA of our cells, but in the folds of our own identity. They remind us that we are not a singular event in evolution, but part of a shared lineage of minds that reached for understanding. To see them clearly is to see ourselves differently, not as the peak of a ladder, but as one branch of an ancient tree, growing from the same roots of compassion and creativity. Imagine for a moment the last of them, a small group huddled in a coastal cave. The sea outside glows silver in the moonlight. The air smells of salt and smoke. They don't know they are the last of their kind. No species ever does. They only know the familiar rhythms of survival: warmth, hunger, kinship. One mother hums to her child, another sharpens a blade. A father watches the tide recede, perhaps wondering what lies beyond it. To them, it was simply another night. To us, it is the end of an epoch. Yet that night, that flicker of warmth against the cold, is the same light that still burns in us, the same instinct to gather close, to remember, to hope. In that sense, they never truly disappeared. They became us. They remain in our gestures, our songs, our dreams of belonging. We rediscover them not through excavation, but through recognition. And in that recognition, the loneliness of our species dissolves. We're no longer the only ones who ever wondered why we exist, or who looked at the stars and felt both awe and insignificance. We shared that feeling once, across species, across worlds of thought. That is perhaps the most comforting realization of all, that we have never been alone in our humanity. Their story ends, but our understanding continues. Each discovery, each fossil, each strand of DNA is not just data. It's a handshake across time, a greeting between minds separated by millennia but united in wonder. To stand before a Neanderthal skeleton in a museum is to feel that silent recognition, not a relic of something alien, but a mirror of something familiar. They belong to our story as we belong to theirs. Humanity, it seems, was always plural, always shared, always bigger than we imagined. And maybe, when we look back from the future, we'll see that this realization that we're not the only ones who loved, created, or dreamed was one of our greatest acts of humility. The story of the Neanderthal ends not in extinction, but in remembrance, not in tragedy, but in connection. Because to know them is to widen the circle of what it means to be human, and to see that circle as vast enough to hold us all. In the quiet that follows their fading footsteps, something remains, a promise, a presence, a whisper in the bones of time. We never walked alone, we never thought alone, we never were alone.